Tonight we're stepping into the steamy candlelit world of ancient Rome, a place where the marble floors are polished, the silk sheets are carefully arranged, and the expectations behind closed doors are anything but subtle. What was sex really like back then? Well, let's just say, if you think your dating life is complicated, buckle up. You're about to be dropped into a world where who you loved, or rather who you used, wasn't just about emotion or attraction. It was politics, it was dominance, it was image. And honestly, you probably won't survive this if you go in with modern assumptions. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me, what city are you in right now, and what time is it? I want to imagine the exact setting as you listen to this. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin by stepping through the arched doorway of a Roman domus, the private family home of the upper class. It smells faintly of oil lamps, crushed laurel, and polished stone. A slave closes the door behind you. You're here as an observer, but let's not pretend you're invisible. Everyone here notices you, because in Roman society, sex wasn't just a private act. It was a public performance written in your posture, your clothing, your household layout, even the arrangement of your bedroom furniture. Yes, seriously, the Roman bed wasn't just a bed, it was a symbol. Inside the atrium, you find a careful architecture of sexuality and social hierarchy. The cubiculum, or bedroom, sits not tucked away for privacy, but often accessible, sometimes even visible from the main hall. For elite Romans, especially men, sex wasn't something to be hidden, it was something to own. The act itself might happen in shadows, but its implications echoed across dinner parties and Senate meetings. If you were a man, your sexual conquests weren't just permitted, they were expected, and not just with your wife. Wives were for heirs, desire was for others. You pass by frescoes on the wall. Some are mythological, sure, but others are just graphic. Bodies tangled in ecstatic poses, gods mid-transformation, mortals clearly not worried about curtains. These weren't considered dirty or embarrassing, they were decorations, a talking point over wine. Romans had no shortage of ways to celebrate eroticism in their living spaces. Picture it. You're reclining at a dinner party, sipping spiced wine, chatting about grain imports while a fresco of Pan getting it on with a goat stares down at you. It's casual. And don't get the idea that this open expression meant free love for all. Far from it. Everything was about who was doing what to whom. You could be as sexually wild as you wanted, as long as you were dominant. Being the giver in a sexual act was seen as masculine, powerful, respectable. Being the receiver, risky business, unless you were a slave, prostitute, or someone outside the citizen class. For free Roman men, this distinction was everything. And for women, well, that's where it gets more suffocating. Step into a matron's shoes. You're born into a high-status family, maybe married off at 14, to a man twice your age, or 3 times, depending on how many prior wives he's buried. Your role is to be modest, fertile, and discreet. You probably won't get a say in anything beyond curtain fabric. Yet behind the scenes, you might be hosting secret lovers, writing veiled love poetry, or confiding in a trusted maid. You have to be clever, because if your affairs come to light, that's death sentence, or exile if you're lucky. Adultery was technically a crime for women, but not for men. A husband could do what he wanted, and you were expected to keep your sandals laced and your eyes down. Not that love didn't exist. Oh, it did. Sometimes in the form of aching poetry, tear-streaked goodbyes, or longing glances in the marketplace. But it rarely looked like marriage. And when love did creep into the villa, it often did so through back doors, via slaves, secretaries, musicians, or foreign courtesans who knew how to play the game. Love was a gamble, marriage was a strategy. Now, if you're wondering where romance fits into all this, yeah, so were they. Ancient Roman romance wasn't built around the slow-burn emotional intimacy you're used to seeing in period dramas. It was often transactional. If you were rich, you pursued pleasure as a right. If you were poor, your choices were limited, maybe a hurried affair in the back of a tavern, or if you were lucky, an affair with someone slightly above your station. One historical fact for you. Emperor Augustus, the guy who reshaped the whole empire, passed morality laws encouraging marriage and childbearing. He even penalised bachelors and gave tax perks to parents with 3 or more kids. And yet, his own daughter Julia became infamous for having lovers in every port. Irony, thy name is patrician hypocrisy. Here's a quirky detail. Romans believed certain foods influenced sexual vigour. Oysters, yes, but also cabbage. That's right, some Roman men were convinced that raw cabbage could spark a fiery night in the sheets. Imagine nibbling lettuce seductively before a tryst. Not exactly smooth, but hey, they swore by it. Still, despite all the mosaics and statues with their prominent anatomical enthusiasm, historians still debate just how liberal Rome really was. Were all those sex-filled images meant to reflect real-life behaviours, or were they part of an idealised performative culture where showing off was everything? Some scholars argue that the anything-goes Rome is a modern fantasy projected onto a deeply stratified moralistic society. Others say that yes, Romans were as sexually expressive as their art suggests, and that the moralists were simply shouting into the void like a toga-clad version of Think of the Children. As you finish exploring this domus, you start to get it. Sexuality in Rome wasn't about mutuality, it was about control. Pleasure was often one-sided. Consent wasn't part of the conversation unless you were in the rarest kind of relationship. One built on deep affection, trust, and above all equality, which was about as rare as a chaste senator. You step back out into the sun-bleached streets of Rome, but now your eyes are trained differently. You've seen what happens behind the silk curtains and under the frescoed ceilings, but what about the rules? The invisible grid of laws and expectations that dictated who could sleep with whom, and what happened when people broke the code? Welcome to the very Roman concept of lex de pudicitia, the law of modesty. And oh boy, does it not play fair. Rome had laws for everything: roads, grain rations, togas, and of course sex. Not because the state was particularly prudish, but because sex was about order. Who belonged where, who had power and who didn't. Start with the Augustan marriage laws. These weren't casual little guidelines printed in a pamphlet. These were state-enforced mandates. Augustus, trying to restore what he called traditional values, after decades of civil war and orgy-fueled aristocracy, decreed that Roman citizens needed to marry and reproduce. Childless couples paid the higher taxes. Widows were expected to remarry within a set period. Adultery? Suddenly a public crime, and who could be punished? Not the cheating husband, nope, his wife, or her lover. Even if she was stuck in a loveless political marriage to someone 3 times her age. Let's say you're a Roman woman who's caught cheating. The punishment could be exile, literal banishment to an island. You might lose your property, your children, even your patria potestas, that is your father's protection. You could also be classified as a meretrix, a registered prostitute, meaning any future romantic relationship would legally be treated as commercial. That label stuck like olive oil on linen. But if you were a man, well, unless your affair was with another man's wife, you were generally in the clear. You could sleep with slaves, concubines, prostitutes, anyone considered outside the respectable Roman citizen pool. The only real legal red line was violating someone else's pudicitia, a concept tied up with modesty, honour, and the illusion of control. And by someone, they usually meant upper-class women and adolescent citizen boys. Anyone else? Fair game? Now here's where things get even more tangled. Say you're a Roman senator, you've got money, clout, and access, but even you can't marry just anyone. There were strict restrictions against marrying actresses, dancers, or prostitutes, even retired ones. If you tried, your political career could crash faster than a chariot with a broken axle. The idea was that women with immoral backgrounds would pollute the bloodline and shame the family name. Of course, that didn't stop many senators from visiting those same women regularly. Just don't try to make it official. The legal system also involved a charming practice called accusatio stupri, or accusation of defilement. If a young woman was believed to have lost her virginity out of wedlock, her father or male guardian could sue the offender. This wasn't about justice, it was about compensation for dishonour. The girl's feelings? Irrelevant. In many cases, the accused would pay a fine or marry the girl to restore her value. Romantic, huh? Now imagine a Roman courtroom. Marble columns, stern magistrates, a sweating defendant in a worn tunic. He's accused of seducing a senator's daughter. There's talk of letters, poetry, secret meetings in gardens. It's scandalous. The crowd leans in. But the outcome doesn't really hinge on truth. It hinges on status. Who's more powerful? Whose connections reach further? Justice in Rome wasn't blind. It was watching very closely to see whose name mattered more. One historical example that always stirs debate is the case of Clodia Pulchra and Marcus Caelius Rufus. Clodia, an aristocratic woman with a reputation for affairs and poisonings, depending on who you ask, accused Caelius, her former lover, of attempted murder. He fired back, accusing her of promiscuity and corruption. Enter Cicero, Rome's most famous orator, who turned the courtroom into a theatre of slut-shaming and class warfare. He painted Clodia as a wild widow with too much freedom and not enough morals. The jury laughed, Caelius was acquitted, and Clodia's name became a cultural punchline for centuries. But was she guilty? Or just a woman who played by male rules and got burned for it? Scholars still argue. Now, for something a little quirkier. There was an old Roman ritual called the lectisternium, a public banquet where statues of gods were placed on couches and served food as if they were living guests. During times of crisis, like famine or plague, Romans would literally try to appease the divine with offerings, including acts of purification, mass fasting, and sometimes mass abstinence. That's right, sex bans. Temporary celibacy imposed to avoid offending the gods. Whether people followed them, that's another question. Human nature being what it is, probably not. Interestingly, many laws regulating sex weren't really about protecting people, they were about appearances. Roman society valued gravitas, or seriousness, especially for men. If you indulged too openly, flaunted affairs, or got caught in scandal, you weren't just a bad boy, you were unstable, untrustworthy, dangerous to the Republic. Even emperors weren't safe. Julius Caesar was famously rumoured to be every woman's man and every man's woman. His enemies used that against him. True or not, the gossip stuck. Which brings us to a deeper debate among historians. Were these laws actually enforced, or were they just threats used selectively by the powerful? The evidence is fuzzy. While some people were indeed punished or exiled, many seem to have flaunted the rules with little consequence. Maybe the laws were like the city's aqueducts, impressive in theory, but full of leaks. What's certain is that in ancient Rome, sex wasn't just a personal decision. It was a civic act. It had consequences that could touch every corner of your life, your property, your future, your name, and while men wrote the laws, shaped the debates, and dodged most of the punishment, women bore the brunt of enforcement. Same story, different century. By the time you return to the alleyways outside the Domus, you realise that Roman sexuality wasn't just about appetite. It was about order, control, and keeping people in their place, legally, socially, politically. And if the law said you were out of line, well, the Senate might not come for your head, but they'd definitely come for your reputation. You walk a little farther now, your sandals skimming the sun-warmed cobblestones, and suddenly you see it, Rome's true engine humming beneath the marble and politics. Power. Tonight, we're not just talking about who had sex with whom, but who was on top, socially, politically, and quite literally. In Rome, sex wasn't just about pleasure, it was about dominance, and everyone knew exactly where they stood, or lay. Let's get something clear right away. Roman culture didn't divide sexuality by gender the way we often do now. No one was labelled straight or gay. The key distinction wasn't who you were having sex with, it was what role you played. If you were the penetrator, you were in the power seat. You were dominant, assertive, masculine. That was fine, applauded even. But if you were on the receiving end, that was where things got messy, especially if you were a citizen male. Because submitting in any way, emotionally, sexually, was seen as weakness, effeminacy, a social stumble in a world obsessed with hierarchy. So imagine this. You're a Roman aristocrat, reclining at a dinner party, smug and wine loose, boasting about your latest escapades. No one cares if your lover was male or female. What matters is that you did the taking, not the giving. You were in control. If you mention a male slave, no one blinks. But if you hint that you enjoyed being the receptive partner, even in a joke, there are awkward silences. Maybe someone shifts in their seat. Your status suddenly feels thinner than your tunic. This distinction ran deep. Even Roman slang reflected it. The word synedos was a term of scorn for a man who was seen as passive in sex, especially with other men. It implied weakness, softness, a failure of Roman masculinity. On the other hand, a man who dominated slaves or prostitutes of either gender? Perfectly fine. In fact, it might even boost your reputation, as long as no one important took offence. Now, you might be wondering, what about women? Were they held to the same logic? Yes and no. Roman women, especially upper-class ones, weren't supposed to want sex, let alone initiate it. Female desire was dangerous, something to be managed, contained, like a kitchen fire or a Senate debate. The ideal Roman woman was modest, silent, and obedient. But that didn't mean women had no power at all. Some of them used the exact rules of dominance to flip the game. Enter the rare but fascinating figure of the domina, a woman who through wealth, cleverness, or sheer audacity, gained sexual power. Maybe she was a widow with property, free from her husband's control. Maybe she was a noblewoman like Messalina, who, according to scandalous gossip, disguised herself and competed with prostitutes in brothels just to prove her stamina. Whether those stories were true or not isn't the point. The point is that Rome feared women with unchecked sexual agency. They represented chaos, upturned hierarchies. They were walking breaches in the power structure. Take another stroll with me, this time into a barracks on the edge of the empire, where a Roman general is disciplining his troops, not with lashes or chains, but by humiliating them. One punishment, reserved for cowardice or mutiny, was forced sexual submission. It wasn't about sex, it was about reducing someone's status to the lowest possible level, turning them into a thing. That's how Roman minds understood dominance. It wasn't about the act, it was about transforming the other person into less than human. One historical example, the poet Martial, always quick with a jab, once mocked a senator for allegedly receiving oral sex from a male slave. Martial's issue wasn't that the act happened, it was that the senator let it happen to him. In a society so obsessed with rank, even your bedroom choices could affect your political standing. If people thought you lacked control in private, they doubted you had any business in public life. Now, here's a slightly weirder fact. Romans saw the body as a literal metaphor for the state. Just as the head ruled the limbs, the man ruled the household, and Rome ruled the provinces. To submit sexually was to invert that structure. That's why so many sexual insults in Roman comedy are political. You weren't just dirty, you were unstable. An insult to the empire's order. You stumble across a stall selling wax figurines, tiny exaggerated representations of people caught mid-coitus. You blink. Some of them are almost cartoonish in their detail, others shockingly lifelike. These weren't just trinkets, they were talismans, sometimes used in fertility rituals, as sometimes just for fun. But their exaggerated forms always had a point. This is who has the power. Look at the size, the posture, the smirk. Even in play, the hierarchy stood tall. There's a scholarly debate that bubbles just under the surface of all this. Were the Romans really as obsessed with power dynamics as we think, or are we projecting modern ideas backward? Some argue that we overread the sources, that Roman sexuality was more complex and private than we give it credit for. Others insist that the sheer volume of jokes, insults, legal codes and art devoted to sexual dominance proves otherwise. Rome was about order, and sex was one more battlefield on which to assert it. Another quirk? Even Roman astrology got in on the act. Some guides warned that being born under certain constellations, like Virgo or Pisces, could predispose a boy to passivity. That's right. Your future bedroom role, written in the stars, it wasn't science, but it wasn't just superstition either. It was yet another layer in a society obsessed with categorizing control. By the time the sun begins to dip behind the tiled roofs and temple columns, you start to understand something unsettling. Sex in Rome wasn't just about desire, it was about ranking. Every act confirmed or challenged the structure of the world. The powerful took, the weak received. That was the rule. And if you dared to blur that line, well, you better have a fast horse and a forgiving reputation. The light fades as you step deeper into the quieter districts of Rome, where the stone walls muffle the hum of the streets and the scent of incense drifts from behind closed shutters. You pass rows of respectable homes, modest but well kept. These are the domains of marriage, of household management, of whispered hopes for lineage and legacy. But here's the thing, Roman marriage wasn't built on romance. It was a chessboard, and every piece was moved by strategy. If you've ever thought your dating life was transactional, meet the Roman version of love, marriage as alliance. For the elite, tying the knot wasn't about chemistry, it was about consolidating wealth, cementing family alliances, and boosting one's standing in the political ladder. Imagine your father arranging your wedding before your voice has even changed. Because your bride's uncle has ties to a senator, you don't get to protest. You smile, you show up, you say, ubi tu Gaius, ego Gaia, the Roman equivalent of I do, and boom, you're married. Congratulations, now go make heirs. For women, the situation was more intense. Many Roman girls were married off around the age of 12 to 14. That wasn't shocking by their standards, it was considered ideal. The earlier a girl was wed, the more years she could be fertile, and fertility was her primary job. Emotional maturity, personal preference, or attraction, not even on the checklist. The ideal Roman matron was chaste, obedient, and prolific. Her entire public identity was tied to how well she bore and raised legitimate children. And yet, despite the cold contract of marriage, people were still people. You can't legislate away longing. Husbands strayed, of course, often without much secrecy or shame. If you were wealthy, you might keep a concubine or two. Maybe a few slaves designated for your pleasure. For men, this was normal. It didn't matter whether your side partners were women or men, so long as they weren't someone else's wife or a freeborn Roman citizen. The law and society didn't care about feelings, they cared about status contamination. Now, Roman wives, their options were far more limited. Adultery wasn't just frowned upon, it was criminal. If caught, a wife could be divorced on the spot, publicly shamed and exiled. Her lover could be executed, especially if he was a lower-class man encroaching on noble blood. And if the husband didn't report her, he himself could face legal consequences for not acting fast enough to defend his household's honour. That's how seriously they took marital control. It was practically state business. But don't let that fool you into thinking all Roman wives were meek little statues. Some were sharp, cunning, and unafraid to bend the rules in quiet ways. Letters, secret meetings, coded poetry, alliances with sympathetic servants, it's all in the historical record, tucked between the official lines. One famous woman, Sempronia, was involved in the Catalan conspiracy and described as both politically savvy and sexually bold. The historian Sallust practically clutched his pearls writing about her. He couldn't believe a woman could be that intelligent and that uninhibited. Imagine that. One of the more revealing practices of Roman marriage was manus, literally hand. There were two main types of marriage, one in which the wife passed into her husband's manus, meaning he legally controlled her as if she were a daughter, and another, more modern version, in which she remained under her father's control. Why would a couple choose that second option? Because sometimes being your husband's legal child was just a step too far, even for Rome. Over time, this latter arrangement became more common, especially among elite families trying to keep property in the paternal line. Now here's a quirky little custom that says a lot. On the wedding night, it was traditional for the bride to remove her tunica recta, her special wedding dress, in front of her new husband, and no one else. She also unbound her hair, a signal of submission to her new life. Some sources claim the husband would symbolically take a belt off her tunic, perhaps with a ceremonial phrase like, "Thus I claim you." It's intimate, yes, but also deeply performative. Sex wasn't just about connection, it was a rite of passage, a confirmation that the alliance had taken root. And what if the marriage didn't work? Divorce in Rome wasn't rare. In fact, it was relatively easy, at least for the man. He could issue a notice, return the wife's dowry, and that was it. A woman technically could also initiate divorce, but only under specific legal and financial conditions. The key question was always, who has the leverage? If she had a powerful father or her own fortune, she might walk. If not, she stayed, or she vanished into domestic obscurity. One historical case that always raises eyebrows is that of Livia Drusilla, wife of Augustus. She divorced her first husband while pregnant with his child so she could marry Octavian, the future emperor. Bold move, right? It shocked everyone. But Octavian was powerful enough to override the scandal, and Livia played her role to perfection afterward, becoming the ultimate Roman matron, discreet, intelligent, and ruthlessly loyal to the imperial brand. Scholars still debate whether her first husband had any say at all. Probably not. And then there were the truly bizarre cases. Emperor Claudius married his niece Agrippina, who had her own child from a previous marriage, young Nero. Yes, that Nero. Claudius adopted him, raising him as heir. Agrippina, ambitious and calculating, knew exactly what she was doing. Later rumours, unconfirmed but popular, suggested she seduced Claudius to maintain her grip on power. Did it happen? Maybe, maybe not. But the fact that people believed it says a lot about how Romans understood the power plays inside a marriage. Scholars continue to argue about how much affection existed in Roman marriages. Some say it was purely political, a matter of duty and lineage. Others believe that real affection, and even love, did bloom within these rigid structures. They point to tomb inscriptions where husbands and wives praised each other with unexpected tenderness. One gravestone reads, "To my wife, who lived with me in harmony for 40 years, without a quarrel." That's either deep affection or the most passive-aggressive eulogy ever written. Still, walking through these quiet neighbourhoods, you can feel the weight of performance. Every marriage had to look proper, every child had to be legitimate, every gesture, from the dowry to the dinner seating, reinforced a system of appearances. And behind closed doors, maybe there was kindness, maybe there was resentment, maybe, if you were very lucky, there was something like love. But the system didn't care. It just wanted the next generation, the next heir, the next alliance. Romance was optional, legacy was not. You've wandered through the formalities of Roman marriage, that stiff toga-wrapped ritual of lineage and legacy, but now you slip down a narrower street, one that smells faintly of myrrh, roasted nuts, and sweat. It leads you not into a grand domus, but into the shadowy corners of the Roman heart, where passion wasn't framed by contracts or contracts disguised as vows. Here, it's about the unofficial, the in-between, the spaces where desire did whatever it wanted, as long as it didn't threaten someone's status. Welcome to the world of mistresses, courtesans, and concubines. Start with the concubine. In Rome, the term wasn't as scandalous as it sounds today. A concubina was often a long-term companion, sometimes a slave, sometimes a freedwoman, legally recognised but not officially wed. For men of means, especially those tired of politically strategic wives, concubines offered something more personal, less bound by obligation, more open to real affection, or at least the fantasy of it. They couldn't inherit, they had no dowry, and their children, while often raised within the household, were rarely considered heirs. Still, some men kept concubines for decades. Some even grew old together. The line between mistress and life partner could blur, just not legally. And let's be clear, women couldn't have concubines. Not officially, anyway. The system was built for male indulgence. A woman who took on a male lover outside of marriage was labelled an adulteress, even if the relationship lasted for years. That double standard? Oh, it wasn't subtle. It strutted down the street in a red cloak and winked at everyone. Now, a step up in style and independence. The meretrix, the high-end courtesan. These women weren't housekeepers or silent lovers. They were entertainers, intellectuals, sometimes even political informants. They could read, write poetry, debate philosophy, and keep pace with senators after 3 cups of Falernian wine. Some were ex-slaves who'd worked their way up through the brothel hierarchy. Others were born free but chose a life of calculated companionship over the restrictions of marriage. Either way, they knew the game. They weren't just selling sex, they were selling presence, intrigue, mood. Think more geisha than streetwalker. One famous courtesan was Volumnia Cytheris, a freedwoman who became the mistress of Mark Antony. She travelled with him publicly, scandalising polite society. Cicero loathed her, not just for her past, but for her audacity to move in high circles. She was visible, bold and clever, and those traits made her dangerous. Not because she threatened Rome with armies or alliances, but because she disrupted the tidy narrative of where women were supposed to belong. The legal status of these women varied wildly. Some were registered sex workers, required by law to wear distinctive clothing, usually shorter tunics or bold accessories, to signal their availability. Others operated in private salons, behind locked doors where wealthier clients could indulge without the risk of being seen in a brothel. These private affairs gave the illusion of intimacy. They were illusions that many men willingly fell for. Meanwhile, down in the back alleys and among the merchant class, there were less refined versions of this dynamic. Mistresses who might not be educated or celebrated, but who were still entwined in households across the empire. A merchant might keep a lover in a small rented flat near his shop. A freedman might fall in love with a laundress and set her up with a bit of income and a promise he could never make official. These relationships were informal, often unequal, but real, woven into the rhythms of Roman life. And here's a quirky side note for you. There's graffiti in Pompeii that actually gives us glimpses into these relationships. Scribbled on the wall of one building are words like, "Marcellus loves Julia." And, "If anyone wants to meet nice girls, come to the Lupanar." These weren't love poems, exactly, but they hint at a culture where romance, desire, and public declarations were tangled up in everyday life. One particularly snarky line reads, "Lucius was here with Flora, he paid." Not exactly subtle. The legal divide between wife and mistress was clear, but socially? That's where things got fuzzy. Some concubines were treated better than wives. A man might loathe his spouse and lavish gifts on his lover. Children born from concubines might not inherit by default, but if acknowledged and legitimised, they could climb the social ladder. Some even ended up with political power if their father was high enough in the ranks and willing to ignore the whispers. One of the most dramatic historical examples, the Emperor Augustus's own granddaughter, Julia the Younger, was exiled for an affair, and not even a particularly scandalous one by Roman standards. Meanwhile, his close associate Maecenas openly lived with a woman who was never his wife, and no one blinked. Again, status carved the rules. Morality flexed when power entered the room. Now, there's still a scholarly debate that echoes through this topic like the sound of a lyre down an empty corridor. Were these mistresses and concubines exploited victims, or savvy agents within a limited system? It's probably both. Some women had no real choices. Slaves given to masters, girls sold into brothels. Others learned how to survive, even thrive within the system's cracks. They found patrons, built networks, wrote poetry, even advised politicians. They weren't empowered in the modern sense, but they weren't powerless either. And yes, of course there were scandals. So many scandals. Entire political careers were toppled over affairs gone wrong. Love letters discovered, jealous wives whispering to rivals, secret pregnancies that required quiet adoptions, or, more often, harsh decisions no one talked about in daylight. If you've ever wondered what fueled Roman gossip, it wasn't just gladiators and Senate speeches, it was who was sleeping with whom and why. As you step out of the alley and back onto the main street, the lines between official and unofficial feel blurrier than ever. In a city obsessed with hierarchy, where even desire had rules, the people who coloured outside the lines, the mistresses, the lovers, the unwed companions, they were both scorned and secretly envied. They lived in a space outside duty. And in Rome that was the ultimate rebellion. As the sun rises higher and the heat begins to press down on the cobbled streets, you make your way south, past the teeming market stalls and smoky tabernae, until the roads begin to show cracks and ash. The stones under your feet shift to volcanic dust. You're walking the streets of Pompeii now, or what's left of them. And though Mount Vesuvius froze this place in a moment of fiery silence, its walls still speak. Because here, more than anywhere else in the Roman world, the people left their desires out in the open. On walls, doors, tavern counters, even on stairwells. They didn't write love letters, they wrote graffiti. Step into the Lupanar, Pompeii's most famous brothel. The stone beds are still here, small hard platforms with faint divots worn by time and repetition. The walls are covered in frescoes that don't even pretend to be subtle. Figures caught mid-thrust, mid-laugh, mid-seduction. There's a menu of sorts painted above the doorways, showing different sexual acts like a catalogue, and yes, they were probably priced. The pictures weren't just advertising, they were instructions, a reminder that not everyone who visited could read words, but everyone could read a body. But it's the graffiti that really paints the picture. Sometimes crude, sometimes funny, sometimes strangely sweet. One scratched message reads, "I screwed the barmaid." Another, "Successus was here, full of desire." And then this one, "I don't want to sell my body anymore. Fortune take me home." It's not all jokes and bravado. There are moments of loneliness, vulnerability, even exhaustion etched into these walls. These weren't just messages, they were small acts of defiance or longing or drunken honesty. A Roman version of, "I was here." You start to see a pattern. Sex in Pompeii wasn't something to be hidden or cleaned up for company. It was everywhere. Painted above bakery ovens, doodled outside bathhouses, carved into public benches. There's even a famous example from a guard room. The one-eyed man has banged every girl in Pompeii. Big claims for a guy missing depth perception. Of course, not all of it was about sex. Some graffiti were insults. "Floronius, you're a bore." Some were attempts at poetry. "I love Homeros, may Venus love us both." Others were just bits of daily life. "I paid 2 asses for a haircut, he still messed it up." But the sexual inscriptions make up a huge portion, possibly because that was one of the few safe ways to express yourself in a rigid, status-driven society. Scribbling something vulgar on a wall was a kind of equalizer. Rich or poor, slave or citizen, you could leave your mark, and that's what makes Pompeii so fascinating. Unlike Rome, where elite writers shaped most of what survives, Pompeii lets you hear from the butcher's apprentice, the prostitute, the jealous lover, the drunk poet. It's a snapshot of real lives, real bodies, and real messiness. For example, one particularly graphic wall note reads, "Restituta, take off your tunic and show us your pretty thing." It's crude, yes, but it's also unfiltered, no censorship, no marble polish, just human want carved into plaster. And then there's the question of who was writing this. Most graffiti were done by men, that much is clear from context and tone, but there are a few inscriptions that suggest female authorship, possibly sex workers or bold local women taking control of their own narratives, if only for a sentence. One reads, "Myrtis loves Crescens." That's it. But it feels different. There's affection there, not conquest. Here's a quirky historical footnote. Archaeologists originally dismissed the Pompeii brothel frescoes as too obscene to catalogue properly. For decades they locked these items in what's called the Gabinetto Segreto, or secret cabinet of Naples' Archaeological Museum. Only men could view them, with written permission, no less. The idea was that these objects were too corrupting for women or the general public. Even 2,000 years after they were painted, the moral panic hadn't worn off. It's only in recent decades that scholars have re-examined Pompeii with fresh eyes, not as a den of sin, but as a mirror of everyday Roman life. But here's where scholars disagree. Some argue that Pompeii was uniquely sexualized, possibly because it was a port town full of sailors, traders, and travellers, that it's unfair to hold it up as a symbol of all Roman sexuality. Others say the city was simply preserved unusually well, and that Rome itself was just as sexually expressive. Its graffiti and brothels simply didn't survive the centuries as intact. There's no scholarly consensus, just layers of ash and interpretation. One thing's clear though, for the average person in Pompeii, sex was a public subject. Not shameful, not sacred, just part of life. You didn't whisper about your crush behind closed doors. You carved their name on a tavern wall. If you had a great night with someone and you didn't leave a thank you note, you scratched it into stone. And some of the messages are surprisingly relatable. "I hope your hemorrhoids burn, Oppius." That's less about love, sure, but who hasn't wanted to etch a bad review into a bathroom stall? As you leave the ruins and look back at the cracked mosaics and singed frescoes, it's easy to forget that the people who lived here didn't see themselves as frozen in time. They lived, they laughed, they got jealous, they fell in love, they got dumped. And yes, they had sex, with joy, with frustration, with hope, with guilt, not behind closed doors, but out loud, with a chisel and a wall. It makes you wonder what someone 2,000 years from now will find of your messages. The DM you regretted, the anonymous forum post, the group chat confession, will it look any different? Probably not. You leave the stone beds and soot-stained walls of Pompeii behind and follow the steam. Literally. The closer you get to the heart of Roman civilization, The warmer the air becomes, thick with the mineral tang of sulphur and the faint sweetness of perfumed oil, it leads you to the thermae, see the Roman public bathhouses. And before you roll your eyes and think this is just about hygiene, let's get one thing straight. In ancient Rome, the bathhouse was less about washing and more about watching. You step inside past a towering marble facade, and the first thing you notice is the noise. It echoes. Water sloshing, sandals scraping across wet stone, laughter, arguments, the hollow thunk of a strigil scraping sweat and oil off skin. It's a sensory overload. The smell of warmed flesh and pine resin. The faint whiff of incense someone decided to bring for flair. This isn't a spa retreat. It's a social arena. And for many Romans, it's also the most sexually charged public space they'll enter all week. Roman baths were open to nearly everyone. Rich or poor, slave or senator, you all passed through the same pools, though at different times or in different corners depending on your rank and your coin purse. Some bathhouses segregated by gender. Others didn't bother. Especially in the early empire, everyone stripped down. You'd have seen everything and everyone saw you, which in a society obsessed with dominance and appearances meant your body was on display in more ways than one. There was no such thing as modesty here. You might be discussing trade routes while the guy next to you oils his inner thigh. You might be chatting with a politician who casually lifts one leg onto a bench and reveals far more than his opinion on grain subsidies. It wasn't just tolerated, it was expected. Bodies weren't hidden. They were public property, especially for the male citizen. You were expected to be fit, composed, in control. If your stomach sagged or your thighs jiggled too much, someone might write a poem about it later. Martial and Juvenal made careers out of mocking flabby patricians who couldn't pull off their bathhouse struts. Now, here's where things get steamier. The apodyterium, the changing room, was often where flirtation started. Locker rooms with columns and benches, places to undress, gossip and scan the room with one eye while pretending to look for your sandals. Once you made it to the tepidarium, warm room, caldarium, hot room, or frigidarium, cold plunge, the dance of glances really got going. There were no towels to hide behind. Everyone knew what they were seeing and what they were showing, and yet for all this exposure, outright sexual acts weren't openly permitted. Not officially. The bathhouse was a public institution, not a brothel. But the rules were slippery, much like the floors. Sex didn't happen in the pools, supposedly, but in the rooms attached, the massage parlours, the side chambers, the dark corners. Some bathhouses even had upstairs lounges with couches and curtains, where business could be conducted away from watchful eyes. Here's a quirky little detail. Roman bathhouses often employed attendants called elliptae, who were not just oil scrapers but often masseurs. And massage in Rome was rarely just massage. If a wealthy patron requested an extra hand, the elliptae would oblige or get someone who would. That service wasn't free, but it was discreetly arranged. Think of them as the ancient world's worst-kept secret. There's evidence that brothel workers were sometimes stationed near or within large thermae. A patron could get clean, gossip with senators, flirt with a slave boy or girl, and then slip away for a more intimate appointment. It was one-stop shopping with the added benefit of hot water and political networking. One preserved bathhouse in Ostia, Rome's port city, features mosaics with playful and occasionally risque imagery. Dolphins, tridents, nude athletes with just enough detail to raise an eyebrow. These weren't just decorative, they were mood setters, reminders that the bathhouse was a sensual zone. Not sexual in the vulgar sense, but charged with energy. Everyone was watching. Everyone was watched. There's a famous letter from Seneca in which he complains about the noise at his local bathhouse. Men grunting, girls laughing, bodies slapping against water, arguments breaking out, coins clinking, gossip echoing off the marble. He found it unbearable. But that chaos is what made the bathhouse the place to be. It wasn't just about washing dirt off your back, it was about maintaining your place in the social order. Who you spoke to, who you didn't speak to, who you sat beside in the hot room, every move was measured. Now, scholars still argue over how much actual sex happened inside the bathhouse walls. Some say the steamy rumours are exaggerated by the moralistic writers who wanted to criticise Roman decadence. Others believe the bathhouse was, essentially, a state-sanctioned flirtation zone with plenty of unofficial business going on. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. There's little doubt that some bathhouses were more respectable than others. Some catered to families. Others? Let's just say if the walls could talk, they'd start with a wink. And yes, these spaces were dangerous too. For lower status individuals, especially slaves or freed persons, the line between flirtation and coercion was thin. If you were young, attractive and unprotected, you could be touched, harassed or worse. It wasn't fair, it wasn't safe, but it was the reality of a culture where power trumped consent. One wrong glance could turn into a humiliating encounter, one you couldn't complain about without risking punishment. Still, Not all encounters were exploitative. Some were consensual, playful, even affectionate. People met lovers in the steam. They made eyes across the cold plunge. They brushed fingers while applying oil. The bathhouse, for all its chaos, allowed for chance encounters, the kind that don't happen in structured, supervised spaces. You didn't need to know someone's name, you just needed to like the way they looked wet. As you leave the bathhouse feeling slightly overheated and more aware of your own body than you'd like, you can't help but marvel at how naturally the Romans wove sensuality into their public routines. Here, sexuality wasn't hidden in bedrooms or behind euphemism. It steamed and shimmered in the open, slipping between gossip and grooming, politics and pleasure. And when the water cooled and the lamps were extinguished, the real heat, the kind whispered about over wine, lingered in the stories people carried home. You step out of the bathhouse, skin still warm from the caldarium, head spinning with equal parts eucalyptus oil and unspoken tension. But once you rejoin the dry world of togas, sandals and strict social ladders, everything snaps back into place. Suddenly the freedom of the thermi evaporates. You're reminded that in Rome, what you could do in the shadows often had nothing to do with what you were allowed to do in daylight, especially if you were a woman. Tonight, we're staring down one of Rome's most glaring injustices, the ironclad gender double standard. Start with the basics. If you were born male and free, you had options. Not necessarily happiness, not necessarily control over your life, this was still a brutal world, but the social machine was oiled to favour your body and your choices. You could pursue sex, take lovers, visit brothels, boast about affairs in the forum. You were expected to have appetites. It was part of being Roman. Lust was fine, as long as you kept it structured. Wives for heirs, concubines for comfort, prostitutes for play, and slaves for, well, whatever you wanted. It was a grim buffet, and you never went hungry. Now flip that reality, she yells. You're a woman. Let's say you're upper class, because being poor adds a whole new layer of difficulty we'll get to later. You're married off by 14, maybe 15, to a man you didn't choose, one whose political career depends on your uterus behaving. You're expected to keep your legs together and your opinions quieter than a temple mouse. Adultery, that's not just a scandal, that's a crime. Punishable by divorce, exile, and social annihilation. Even the suspicion of impropriety can cost you everything. And don't even think about confessing love for another man. That's not seen as passion, it's betrayal. Treason, practically. Meanwhile, your husband is out bragging over garum-soaked oysters about the 3 slaves he bedded last week. No one blinks. If you complain, you're called jealous. If you stay silent, you're a good wife. If you retaliate with your own affair, you're a whore, and probably on your way to a windswept rock in the Aegean, where noble women go to disappear. Let's talk about one such disappearance. Julia the Elder, daughter of Augustus. She was smart, witty, wildly popular among the young elite, and according to reports, not all that interested in playing the part of chaste Roman matron. She had lovers, many of them. Some say she met them in the forum, others say she met them in the very house Augustus had given her. When the rumours grew too loud to ignore, Augustus, yes, her own father, had her exiled. Not just quietly removed from court, but publicly condemned for violating the new moral laws he had passed. Laws that, just to be clear, didn't apply to men in the same way. Her lovers were either exiled or executed. Julia, banished for life. She died far from the city she once lit up with her laughter. Her name was erased from monuments. She became a cautionary tale. This wasn't an exception, this was policy. And don't be fooled by the seductive images of goddesses and priestesses lounging with grapes in hand. Real Roman women had very little control over their own sexuality. Their virginity was a family asset, their wombs a political tool, their pleasure, mostly irrelevant. Roman love poetry is full of longing, jealousy and desire, but rarely from the woman's perspective. She's an object, a muse, a reward, or worse, a threat. If she loves too freely, she's dangerous. If she resists, she's a cold-hearted tease. And if you were lower class or enslaved, things were even worse. You had no legal protection at all. A male citizen could use you however he wanted, without consequence. If you bore his child, it didn't matter. The child was a slave like you, unless he specifically freed them. You could be rented out, trafficked, sold with reproductive potential listed like an extra skill on your resume. And still, even then, Roman society would blame you if a scandal emerged. That's how deep the double standard ran. The people with the least power carried the most shame. Now here's something odd. Despite all this, there were moments when women exercised quiet agency. Not freedom exactly, but navigation. They sent coded messages through servants, wrote erotic poetry under pseudonyms, passed down contraceptive recipes like family heirlooms. One recipe involved a mixture of wool soaked in pomegranate rind and honey, inserted before intercourse to prevent conception. Effective? Probably not. Symbolically important? Absolutely. It was a small act of resistance in a world where women were expected to conceive on command. Even in literature, you can find flickers of pushback. Ovid's Ars Amatoria, The Art of Love, gives advice to both men and women on how to seduce and deceive. He tells women how to cheat discreetly, how to fake tears, how to manipulate their lovers. It's cheeky, sure, but it's also subversive. Ovid knew the game wasn't fair, so he handed women a few cheat codes. The state didn't like that. Augustus exiled him too. And scholars, they're still debating the impact of these cultural rules. Some argue that elite women actually wielded considerable influence through their roles as wives, mothers, and social hosts. Others insist that any power they had was tightly tethered to a man's status. The truth, of course, is tangled. Some women bent the rules, others broke them and paid. Most just found a way to survive inside them. Here's a quirky tidbit. In Roman funerary art, husbands and wives are often shown side by side, lovingly gazing at each other. The man holds a scroll, the woman holds a spindle or key. It's meant to show their harmony. He manages the public world, she the private. It's sweet, sure, but also a reminder. She stays in the home. He goes out and lives. As you walk through the forum, past the grand temples and fading statues, it's hard not to feel the weight of that disparity. The stones whisper of generals and senators, but the women? They're harder to find. Not because they weren't here, but because their voices were silenced, their stories stripped of complexity, their pleasures erased or punished. So next time someone says Rome was all orgies and free love, remind them it depended very much on who you were. For some, desire was a celebration. For others, it was a sentence. You slip away from the chatter of the forum and duck into a quieter colonnade near the Curia, where marble steps glint in the midday sun and the shadows of history feel a little longer. It's easy to imagine that these stone walls were silent witnesses to treaties, decrees, and the measured hum of debate, but also to something a little juicier, because Rome wasn't just ruled by laws, it was ruled by whispers, and nowhere were those whispers louder than in the Senate. Tonight, we're poking around the scandal-soaked linens of Rome's political elite, where sex, ambition, and shame made for one very messy power triangle. The Senate of Rome on paper was the embodiment of gravitas. Stiff robes, stiff necks, and supposedly stiff morals. These were the men writing laws, leading armies, and debating the future of the Republic. But behind those polished speeches and carefully trimmed beards, oh, it was chaos. Senators weren't monks, they were men, and some of them were very busy after dark. Sexual rumour was a political weapon. If you couldn't defeat your rival on the floor of the Curia, you might just out him as a libertine, an adulterer, or, gasp, a passive partner in bed. That last one was especially fatal to your image. As we've said before, Romans didn't define sexuality by gender so much as by power roles. A senator accused of being submissive in sex wasn't just being mocked, he was being symbolically stripped of his authority. If he couldn't rule in the bedroom, how could he rule in the Republic? One of the juiciest examples comes from Julius Caesar himself. His political enemies called him every woman's husband and every man's wife. They whispered that, while stationed in Bithynia, he'd played a little too nice with King Nicomedes. The accusation haunted him for years, even when he was conquering Gaul and rewriting Rome's history. It wasn't just personal, it was political ammo. In Roman politics, you didn't have to prove anything, you just had to get people laughing at the idea. That did the damage. Now, whether the Caesar Nicomedes rumour was true, historians debate it. Probably not, but that didn't matter. The idea of the great Caesar being penetrated by a foreign king, that was the insult. It made him vulnerable, foreign, feminised, out of control, and it followed him all the way to the Ides of March. The obsession with sexual purity, at least for appearances, extended to an entire political family's image. Wives, daughters, even distant cousins had to behave impeccably, or risk dragging down a man's career. Remember Clodius Pulcher? He was caught sneaking into the women-only Bonadir festival dressed as a woman. Why? To seduce Pompeia, the wife of Julius Caesar. The scandal was massive. Caesar divorced Pompeia immediately, not because he believed she was guilty, but because, in his words, Caesar's wife must be above suspicion. That one line echoed through Roman history. Being squeaky clean wasn't enough. You had to look clean, smell clean, and never be caught near dirty laundry. It's not like the senators were behaving, though. These were the same men hosting private dinners where dancers and prostitutes were entertainment, where slaves served drinks while barely dressed, and where deals were made in between groans of pleasure and the clink of goblets. Some senators kept male lovers, others boasted about mistresses like they were wine vintages. But as long as it didn't make headlines, or wall graffiti, it was shrugged off. Quiet indulgence, acceptable, public scandal, that was where the knives came out. One emperor who really pushed the boundary was Elagabalus. A teenage ruler from Syria, he was appointed emperor at just 14 and shocked Rome with his flamboyance, gender fluidity, and unapologetic sexuality. He married 5 women and took male lovers, including a charioteer he called his husband. He wore makeup, preferred to be called a queen, and is said to have hosted banquet orgies that made even Caligula look tame. Senators were horrified. Not necessarily because of the sex, but because Elagabalus didn't hide it. He wore his scandal like perfume, and that made him dangerous. Eventually, he was assassinated and thrown in the Tiber. His name was scraped from records. Lesson learned, the Senate could handle perversion but not visibility. And yes, there were fringe cases that make your jaw drop. One senator was rumoured to have held orgies where he assigned lovers to guests by lottery, like a perverted version of Secret Santa. Another was said to use slaves as living furniture, a table of backs, a cushion of thighs. Exaggeration? Maybe. But the fact that these rumours existed, and were believed, tells you what kind of sexual theatre Rome was capable of imagining. Here's a quirky twist. Romans used astrology as dirt too. Political rivals might circulate your birth chart and claim that your Mars placement made you weak in bed or submissive to women. That Saturn in the 7th house meant you'd fall for prostitutes. Your stars weren't just mystical, they were mudslinging material. And even tomb inscriptions weren't safe. One senator's epitaph subtly suggested that he remained faithful to his wife despite temptation, which is basically ancient Latin for he tried, bless his heart. Another was accused posthumously of keeping a male lover disguised as a scribe for 30 years. By the time the rumours hit the marble, there was no way to defend himself. Reputation in Rome was never safe, not even in death. But not all senators were sexual villains. Some were genuinely devoted to their wives, some avoided scandal like plague, and yet their stories rarely survived because they didn't fuel the gossip mill. History, like any good forum crowd, remembers the outrageous. Scholars still argue about how real these political sex scandals were. Were they propaganda or reflections of real chaos behind closed doors? Some say the Senate was simply full of hypocrites, men who enforced public morality while indulging privately. Others argue that the salacious stories were invented by later writers to spice up dull records and sell scrolls. But even if half the stories were lies, the fact that people wanted to believe them says plenty about the world we're looking at. So as you sit there on a worn Senate step, letting the stone warm your back, you realise something. The men who ruled Rome weren't gods or saints. They were ambitious, insecure, and deeply human. And their lust, just like their greed, never stayed behind closed doors for long. It leaked into law. It echoed in insults. It shaped empires. You wander uphill now, past the clatter of wagons and the whispers of shopkeepers, towards something softer in the Roman imagination. Something sacred, glowing with oil lamp light and perfumed with myrtle and rosewater. You're headed for the temple steps, where devotion and desire once blurred into a single golden thread. Because while Rome had plenty of bedrooms and brothels, it also had its gods, and some of those gods were very into sex. Tonight, we're stepping into the embrace of Venus, goddess of love, beauty, and the kind of sensual chaos that could topple kings. To start, you have to understand that the Romans weren't shy about mixing religion with physicality. Unlike later moralizing societies, Rome's divine pantheon wasn't above human behaviour. The gods got jealous. They lied. They cheated. They seduced. And none more so than Venus. Known to the Greeks as Aphrodite, Venus was more than just a pretty face. She was the force of attraction itself, the magnetism that pulled lovers together, the glow in flushed cheeks, the impulse that makes people do stupid things in the name of romance. Her temples weren't austere places of silent worship. They were lively, fragrant spaces full of offerings, prayers, and rituals designed to invite favour in matters of love, fertility, and beauty. If you wanted your partner to stay faithful, you brought Venus a garland. If you hoped to conceive, you left a honey cake. If you were in love with someone you really shouldn't be in love with, you begged her for help. Or forgiveness. The temple of Venus Erycina, perched on the Capitoline Hill, was especially famous. Legend had it that she helped protect the Roman state itself through her power to pacify desire. Soldiers prayed to her before battle, not just for victory, but for safe return to the lovers and families they left behind. And if they were particularly devout, they might leave behind a token. A carved phallus, a bronze hand making a lewd gesture, or even small votive statues with exaggerated breasts and hips. This wasn't considered obscene, it was holy. You might think, wait, sex in religion? Isn't that sacrilegious? Not in Rome. For them, sexuality and spirituality weren't opposing forces. They were complementary, fertility was divine, pleasure was a gift. Even the wedding night had ritual overtones, with offerings to Venus to bless the act of consummation. It wasn't about purity, it was about power. and not the kind you measured in political victories, but the kind that swells in your chest when you're deeply wanted. Now, things get more mystical when you bring in cults, especially the imported ones. Rome was a cultural sponge, and it happily absorbed exotic religions from across the empire. One of the more provocative was the cult of Isis from Egypt. Her followers believed in resurrection, sensual ritual, and divine motherhood. Ceremonies honouring Isis often involved music, incense, and symbolic representations of union between heaven and earth. Some scholars argue that her rites had sexual undertones, possibly even ecstatic experiences that bordered on trance. Not everyone was comfortable with that. In fact, the Senate once tried to crack down on foreign cults they deemed too wild or too effeminate. They feared that uncontrolled desire, even spiritual desire, might weaken the state. Too much worship of passion, it might make men soft. Too many women gathered in secret, it might make them bold. Still, the people kept praying, kept offering, kept believing. You can't outlaw longing. Here's a strange little historical twist. One Roman festival, the Vinalia Urbana, honoured both a barb with wine and Venus. Think about that pairing. It wasn't just about drinking and flirting, it was about celebrating the ripe, the juicy, the sweet ferment of life itself. During the festival, women, yes, even respectable matrons, could pour libations and make pleas for romantic satisfaction. Whether those pleas were spiritual or carnal is up for debate. Knowing Rome, probably both. There's also the matter of sacred prostitution, a much contested concept. Some ancient sources claim that in certain temples, priestesses, or specially chosen women, would offer themselves as part of rituals honouring love deities. Not transactional like in brothels, but symbolic. A merging of body and spirit. Scholars have fiercely debated whether this ever truly happened in Rome, or whether it was misunderstood accounts of fertility rites. Some say it's just Orientalist fantasy. Others point to the presence of sexually themed votive offerings, phallic charms, vulvas carved in marble, as proof that Rome didn't shy away from mixing the holy with the erotic. One thing's for sure. Romans wore their divine desires on their sleeves, or around their necks. The fascinum, a phallic amulet, was worn to protect against the evil eye. Babies had them. Soldiers wore them into battle. You'd see them hanging on doorways, carved into walls, even worn like jewellery. They weren't obscene, they were magical. A reminder that sexuality wasn't just pleasure, it was powerful, dangerous even. So powerful it needed to be harnessed, protected, and occasionally weaponized. You find yourself now in a small shrine to Venus Cloacina. Yes, that's a real title. Protector of both love and the sewers. It's hilarious, but it makes a weird kind of sense. Even love gets messy. Even beauty needs a drainage system. In Rome, nothing was too sacred or too profane. Everything had its place. But let's not romanticize it too much. Religion also upheld the very double standards we've seen before. Temples welcomed men's offerings for sexual success, but punished women who stepped too far outside their roles. A priestess caught in an affair might be flogged, exiled, or executed. The Vestal Virgins, Rome's most sacred women, were required to remain chaste for 30 years. If they broke their vow, they weren't just fired, they were buried alive, their lover was publicly whipped to death. Venus might bless lovers, but Vesta demanded obedience. There was no middle ground. Still, even within those harsh systems, Roman religion gave people a way to express their erotic hopes without shame. To pray for touch, for connection, for fertility, even for good sex, because why wouldn't you want the gods on your side when you stripped down with someone who made your stomach flutter? As you leave the temple, the air warm with incense and memory, it hits you. To the Romans, sex wasn't just an act. It was a force of nature, something divine, something to honour, something to fear, and above all, something that linked mortals to gods with a single shared fire. You stroll back toward the bustle of Rome, away from the perfume-soaked temples and toward something grittier, more human, and far more chaotic, the tangled scrolls of Roman poetry. Not the sanitized verses schoolteachers like to quote, but the wild stuff. The love poems, the dirty jokes, the raw scribbles of desire dressed up in metaphors and cloaked in honeyed Latin. If you want to know what sex felt like in ancient Rome, not just what it looked like on mosaics, you turn to the poets, and boy did they have opinions. Start with Catullus. Think of him as the original oversharer. His poems swing between rapture and rage, sometimes in the same stanza. He adored a woman he called Lesbia, a literary mask for a real aristocratic lover, most likely Clodia Metelli, the same scandalous Clodia accused of poisoning and partying a little too freely. When Catullus was in love, he made you feel it. His poems are dripping with longing, breathless descriptions of kisses, give me 1,000, then 100 more, and that particular kind of obsession that feels both sacred and incredibly needy. But then, when she spurned him or slept with someone else, his verses turned acidic, Suddenly she's a whore, a liar, an animal. His poems about her oscillate wildly, which honestly makes him feel kind of modern. You've probably seen this same emotional whiplash in your friend's texts at 2 a.m. He's not heroic, he's messy, and that's what makes him so real. Through his words, you can feel the pulse of Roman sexuality, not just physical desire, but jealousy, ego, humiliation. Sex wasn't clean or idealised, it was stormy. Then there's Ovid, the smooth-talking playboy of Latin literature. His Ars Amatoria, The Art of Love, is essentially a how-to guide for seduction, delivered with a wink and a glass of wine. It's got tips on where to meet women, the theatre, obviously, how to flatter them, lie but charmingly, and how to navigate affairs. Discretion is key unless you're writing poetry about it. He even wrote a companion book for women, filled with snarky advice on how to fake orgasms and manipulate moody lovers. Ovid wasn't trying to elevate love to something pure, he was giving you the script for the performance. Of course, Rome's power-hungry moralists didn't love Ovid's work. In fact, Augustus, who was on a mission to promote modesty, marriage and baby-making, eventually exiled him. The reason? Officially, it was for a poem and a mistake. The poem was likely the Ars Amatoria. The mistake? Possibly helping someone in the imperial family manage an affair. Scholars still argue about it. Was Ovid just a scapegoat, or had he really crossed a line? Either way, he spent the rest of his life far from Rome, writing melancholic verses about exile and cold beds. Even Propertius, who tried to play the sensitive boyfriend role, wasn't immune to the madness of desire. He worshipped his lover Cynthia, turning her into a goddess and a monster within the same poem. He praised her beauty, her cleverness, her cruelty. His writing drips with contradictions, she enslaves him. He wants her more, she sleeps with someone else. He threatens to die of heartbreak, and also to haunt her bedroom forever, like a ghost in a toga. But here's the thing, these poets weren't writing in a vacuum. They were responding to and shaping the sexual culture of Rome. Their work was read aloud at parties, shared among friends, quoted in arguments. These weren't dusty volumes. They were living documents passed around like gossip, full of coded references, inside jokes, and barely disguised scandals. You can practically hear the wine glasses clink between stanzas. And if you're thinking, okay, but this is all elite male perspective, you're absolutely right. The voices we hear most often are from privileged men writing for other privileged men, about women they idealised, resented, or objectified, sometimes all three at once. Female desire is filtered through male insecurity and projection. The women in these poems rarely get to speak. When they do, it's often through the poet's fantasy of what she should say. That said, there were Roman women poets, though their work survives in frustrating fragments. One name that floats through history is Sulpicia, a young noblewoman whose surviving lines offer rare, raw glimpses into a woman's erotic voice. In one poem, she writes of her joy at finally getting to sleep with the man she loves. She doesn't beg forgiveness or hide behind modesty. She says, basically, I wanted him, I got him, and I'm not sorry. Her words feel bold, unapologetic, and so rare that scholars still argue whether they were truly hers or the invention of a male poet using a female mask. We can't even let her speak without debating if her voice is real. But even if it's mostly men doing the writing, their work tells us something crucial. Roman sexuality was emotional. Not in the candlelit, let's hold hands and talk about our feelings way, but in the raw, teeth-grinding, pacing the room at midnight way. Love in Roman poetry was a fever. Sex was a battlefield. There was pleasure, yes, but also ego, pain, power, and panic. And here's a quirky note. Many Roman love poems included references to magical rituals, charms, curses, potions to win back a straying lover. Propertius once begged Venus to bind his lover to him so tightly she'd forget every other man. Another poet threatened to bury wax dolls and inscribe curses in lead tablets. This wasn't just literary flair, it was part of a broader cultural belief that love, when left to its own devices, was too dangerous. Better to bind it, tame it, force it to obey, even in verse. By the time you leave the circle of poets, your head buzzing with metre and metaphor, you've seen another face of Roman sexuality. Not just the act, but the story of the act, the longing, the heartbreak, the endless cycle of desire, rejection, and revenge. You don't need to see what happened in the bedroom, you can read it, etched in verse, bleeding onto parchment, full of passion and poison. Because in Rome, love wasn't quiet. It was shouted across courtyards, scrawled onto papyrus, and whispered through history in the trembling voice of a poet who probably should have just taken a nap. Now that you've wandered through the sticky sweetness of love poetry and heard every desperate, obsessive syllable, it's time to scrape the sentimentality off your sandals and look at what was going on behind the villa walls. the kind of intimacy that didn't get poetic metre or honeyed couplets. It's the blunt, brutal side of Roman sexuality. Tonight, we step into the shadowy heart of the Roman household and confront one of the empire's ugliest truths, the widespread sexual exploitation of enslaved people. First, a reality check. Rome was a slave society through and through. At its height, as much as a third of the population in the city might have been enslaved. Slaves were everywhere, in the streets, in the kitchens, in the fields, in the bedrooms. And to the average Roman elite, an enslaved person wasn't a person. They were property, a tool, a resource, which meant they could be used in any way the master saw fit, including sexually. Sexual access to slaves wasn't just common, it was normalised. Roman law didn't forbid it. In fact, it assumed it. A master could sleep with a male or female slave as long as it didn't interfere with another citizen's rights. If you violated someone else's property, that was a problem. If you used your own, no one blinked. Consent wasn't a factor. Slaves couldn't say no. They weren't legally capable of refusal because they weren't considered to own themselves. So picture this. You're a young enslaved woman brought into a wealthy household at 13. You serve wine, you clean. And then one night the master calls you to his bed. There's no refusal. Maybe he calls it affection. Maybe he doesn't bother pretending. Maybe the lady of the house knows and looks the other way, because she has no real power to stop it. Your body is just one more thing he owns, like the mosaic floor or the pet monkey in the courtyard. If you become pregnant, the child is his property too, another slave. Unless, of course, he chooses to free the child, or you. It's entirely up to him. Some enslaved concubines were eventually manumitted, granted freedom, especially if they bore children the master liked. Others were passed along like heirlooms, or sold, or discarded. No ceremony, no protection. The Roman term verna referred to a slave born in the household. These individuals often grew up closer to the family, raised alongside the master's children, educated, trusted. But even that familiarity didn't protect them. In fact, it made them more vulnerable. A young, attractive verna might be groomed from childhood to become a bed slave. Raised to obey, flattered with small privileges, told it was an honour to share the master's bed. It wasn't. It was coercion in silk. Male slaves weren't safe either. Wealthy men used both boys and men as sexual property. Young male slaves, especially those considered beautiful, were sometimes castrated to keep their voices high and their bodies docile. These spadones might be used as entertainers, musicians, or personal attendants, roles that often came with unspoken expectations. The line between affection and ownership was a cruel illusion. One of the ugliest practices? The deliciae, literally, delights. These were children, usually slaves, groomed specifically for pleasure, shown off at banquets, dressed in fine clothing, fed sweetmeats, paraded like pets. To the Romans, it was decadence. To modernise, it's straight up horrifying. Even ancient critics like Seneca, who generally avoided moral finger-wagging, expressed discomfort at the way some elites treated their enslaved favourites, especially when they discarded them like worn sandals the moment they became less charming. And yet, despite all this, some of these relationships are described in Roman literature as love. Masters wrote poems for their enslaved lovers. Some even freed them, married them, tried to legitimise the bond. But what does love mean when one person can't leave? When saying no means punishment? Those stories may be more about guilt or illusion than romance. Here's a historical detail that will make your stomach turn. During the Saturnalia festival, when social roles were temporarily reversed, masters were expected to treat their slaves, even dine with them. Some sources describe the atmosphere as light and festive. Others suggest that this 1 week of freedom often involved an uncomfortable farce, masters watching slaves pretend to enjoy themselves, or using the opportunity to stage games that blurred the line between amusement and humiliation. Sexual favours may have been expected as part of this twisted performance of equality, and yet within this brutal system there were moments, fleeting, fragile, where enslaved people carved out bits of agency. Some fell in love with other slaves, created secret families, raised children quietly in the corners of crowded villas. Others performed small acts of resistance, withholding affection, faking illness, sabotaging chores, running away. A few even killed their abusers, though the punishment was swift and brutal. Crucifixion wasn't reserved for rebels, it was for anyone who disrupted the master's will. There's a famous chilling law from the reign of Nero. If a master was murdered in his home, all the household slaves could be executed, regardless of guilt. Why? Because it was assumed they should have prevented it. In one case, over 400 slaves were killed after their master was found dead, many of them women, children, cooks, and nurses. It wasn't justice. It was fear masquerading as order. Still, scholars debate how typical these horrors were. Were most Roman households violent sex camps? Or were these the extremes the outliers recorded because they were so shocking? Some argue that many elite households treated their slaves well by Roman standards, which mostly meant not beating them daily. But even in the kindest homes, sexual access was taken for granted. The system didn't require brutality to be immoral, it just required ownership. And what about love? Could a real mutual relationship ever exist between a Roman and an enslaved person? Is the big debate, even now. Some scholars point to rare examples of lasting partnerships, freedmen who stayed with their former masters, couples who built lives together after manumission. Others argue that the imbalance of power taints any affection beyond repair, that even if feelings were real, the foundation was rotten. You step out of the narrow alley behind the domus, the one where the servant entrances and slave quarters hide behind perfumed courtyards. You try to imagine what it was like to live every day in someone else's home, with no legal body of your own, to be seen, touched, used, and forgotten, because someone else said it was their right. It doesn't leave you with poetry, it leaves you with silence. And in that silence, Rome's grandeur dims a little. And you wander out of the household shadows and into something even murkier, something forbidden, whispered about behind columns and behind closed lips. Because for all Rome's public bravado, for all its erotic graffiti and naked frescoes and poets hollering about their love lives in rhyme, there were still places it feared to look. Places where sex crossed into the realm of the taboo, not just disapproved, but dangerous. Tonight, you're brushing up against the edge of the Roman moral cliff. Incest, forbidden love, and how the elite sometimes treated their family tree more like a spiral staircase. Now, let's be clear, Roman society had rules. Plenty of them. They banned marriage between close relatives, especially siblings, direct bloodlines and parental relationships. The laws were there, the customs were firm, you couldn't marry your sister, your daughter or your niece, unless you were powerful enough to change the rules. Because as with everything else in Rome, when it came to taboo, what mattered wasn't the act, it was who was doing it, and whether anyone had the guts to call them out. Take the emperors. If you're looking for the soft, warm glow of wholesome family values, do not look at the Julio-Claudians. These were people who twisted family relationships into pretzels so tight they'd make a genealogist cry. Claudius, yes, the stammering scholar emperor from history books, married his own niece, Agrippina the Younger. She was brilliant, ambitious, and by many accounts utterly terrifying. Their marriage was technically illegal, so Claudius had the Senate change the law. Problem solved. Morals, flexible. Of course, Agrippina had her own game to play. Her son from a previous marriage was young Nero, yes, that Nero. Claudius adopted him, made him heir, and then, wouldn't you know it, died under suspicious circumstances not long after. Rumours, never quite confirmed, suggested Agrippina poisoned him to secure her son's throne. And here's where things take a turn from Game of Thrones into full-blown soap opera. Later gossip claimed she had an incestuous relationship with Nero. Whether that was true or not, Nero didn't do much to squash the rumours. In fact, some reports say he had a concubine who resembled his mother, just so he could keep reenacting the fantasy. Yikes! And what happened to Agrippina? Well, in classic Roman fashion, her son had her assassinated. It took multiple attempts. Poison, a collapsing ceiling, and finally just good old-fashioned stabbing. Talk about your twisted, yerdible drama. But the point here isn't the murder, it's the way Romans processed the idea of incest. When done by emperors, it became a metaphor for power gone rotten. Even if it wasn't happening, the rumour itself was damning. It made you seem out of control, ruled by lust. Too arrogant to observe the natural order. That's what terrified Rome most. Now here's a different kind of taboo. Adultery between in-laws. You were forbidden to sleep with your stepmother, even after your father died. Same with stepchildren. The ties of family didn't have to be by blood to be considered sacred. It was about preserving the appearance of order. A son seducing his father's widow, or a stepmother trying to control her stepson through seduction, that wasn't just morally wrong, it was politically radioactive. These stories littered Roman gossip like broken amphorae. Take Messalina, wife of Claudius. Yep, the same Claudius who later married his niece. Guy had a type. Messalina was infamous in Roman law for her so-called insatiable appetite. One of the most outrageous tales, probably exaggerated but widely believed, claimed she entered a sexual competition with a professional prostitute and won, outlasting her over 24 hours. But the scandal that did her in wasn't the volume of her lovers, it was the boldness. She allegedly married her lover, Gaius Silius, while Claudius was away, attempting to set him up as emperor. Whether or not she actually tried to replace Claudius is debated, but the fact that she dared to blur the line between family and politics was enough. She was executed, along with most of her inner circle, because in Rome, family impropriety wasn't just gross, it was a threat to power. And here's a weird little wrinkle. Despite their public revulsion toward incest, the Romans were weirdly tolerant of cousin marriages. Marrying your first cousin, Fine, encouraged even, if it helped to keep wealth in the family. The line was drawn much closer to the core. Siblings? No. Parents or children? Definitely no. But cousins? Perfectly acceptable. It's a reminder that Roman taboos were about social boundaries, not biology. If it didn't destabilise the structure, it was allowed. Now, if you really want to dive into the dark end of the pool, you get into stories that were meant to shock even by Roman standards. Caligula, for example, was said to have slept with all 3 of his sisters. He brought one of them, Drusilla, with him to public ceremonies like a wife. Some sources claim he declared her a goddess after her death. Others say he beat her to death while she was pregnant with his child. Was any of it true? Hard to say. But Caligula was so loathed, so infamously unstable that anything seemed plausible, and that tells you more about Rome than the man himself. So what do the scholars say? Some argue that incest rumours were political tools, invented by rivals to paint a target as unfit to rule. Others believe that, while rare, incest did happen, and was sometimes even ritualised, especially among imperial families trying to mimic divine or Eastern traditions. Either way, the fact that the Roman imagination kept circling back to incest tells you something about their fears, that the very intimacy meant to preserve family could also destroy it. And for ordinary Romans, the line between forbidden and merely frowned upon was blurry. Seducing your sister-in-law? Scandalous but survivable. Sleeping with your niece? Not great, but maybe manageable if no one found out. But touch your own daughter, even by rumour? That was social death. Even the poets steered clear. Well, most of them. Ovid toyed with the idea once, but even he seemed to flinch. Here's a quirky detail. The Romans believed incestuous desire was a kind of madness. It wasn't just immoral, it was unnatural, like a river flowing backward. Some physicians even treated it as a disease of the mort, with herbs and diet changes recommended to restore proper appetites. As if you could just salad your way out of an attraction to your cousin. By the time you step out of these twisted family tales, your stomach might feel a little sour. And that's okay. Not every part of Roman sexuality was celebratory or playful. Some of it was sickly sweet, like wine that's gone to vinegar. The elite, especially, lived in a pressure cooker of control, inheritance and appearances. Sometimes they broke, sometimes they didn't care, and sometimes they destroyed everything around them just to feel something. You take a slow turn away from the poisoned, slick corridors of dynastic drama, half hoping things might lighten up. Spoiler, they don't. Because now you're walking into the lion's den, the imperial palace, and no matter how wide the halls, how smooth the marble, or how delicately the incense coils through the air, you can't help but feel the weight of power here. That's because you're entering the bedrooms of Rome's emperors, and if you thought the scandals ended with the Senate, well, welcome to the next level. Tonight, you're unwrapping the twisted appetites of men who ruled the world, and didn't think the rules applied to them. Let's begin with Caligula, because, of course we are. He ruled for just 4 years, but what a 4 years they were. To this day, no emperor's name is more synonymous with sexual madness. He's described as sleeping with his sisters, turning the palace into a brothel, and ordering noble women to perform like prostitutes at private orgies. Some say he even held dinner parties where couples were paired off, ordered into side rooms, and then judged on their performance when they returned. How much of this is true? That's the eternal debate. The sources, Suetonius, Cassius Dio, Tacitus, wrote decades later, and they clearly hated him. But even if only a fraction is real, it paints a picture of absolute power with zero boundaries. Caligula's supposed most famous act of sexual cruelty? Publicly bedding the wives of senators at banquets, not in secret, in full view of everyone, or close enough. The ultimate move of dominance, taking not just a man's wife but his status, his pride, his face. Afterward, he'd brag about the experience, sometimes even giving reviews. This wasn't just lust. It was psychological warfare performed in silk robes and gold sandals. But Caligula was just the opening act. Enter Nero, child of Agrippina, heir of ambition, and walking Greek tragedy in a laurel crown. He married his stepsister Claudia Octavia, but he wasn't interested, so he divorced her, accused her of adultery, ironic, and had her executed. Then he moved on to his mistress Poppaea Sabina, who he supposedly kicked to death while she was pregnant. Gruesome, yes, but Nero wasn't finished. One of the strangest, most often repeated stories? Nero fell in love with a young freedman named Sporus, who looked strikingly like Poppaea. So Nero had Sporus castrated, dressed him in gowns, and publicly presented him as his wife. They went on tour together, attended banquets. Nero even gave Sporus a dowry. And no one stopped him. They couldn't, because to defy Nero was to die. In this case, to love Nero was to lose your body and identity, replaced by a ghost of a woman he destroyed. And then there was Elagabalus, the teen emperor who made Caligula look restrained. Coming from Syria and appointed by his grandmother's political manoeuvring, he took the throne at age 14 and immediately began flipping Roman norms inside out. He wore makeup, dressed in women's clothes, and declared himself married to a man. Well, technically to several men, one of whom was a charioteer he adored and called his husband. He had wives too, 5 of them, and one of them was a Vestal virgin, an act that was both legally forbidden and cosmically sacrilegious. That's the ancient Roman equivalent of marrying the Pope, live on stage while drunk. Elagabalus built a temple to his sun god and allegedly had himself circumcised, wore jewels on his genitals, and offered huge rewards to doctors who could surgically alter him to become more female. Whether that last part was real, exaggerated, or metaphor for gender nonconformity is still debated. But it points to something bigger. Elagabalus wasn't interested in being Roman. Not in the traditional, straight-laced, straight-postured way. He wanted to exist outside the system, and Rome wasn't having it. He was murdered by his own guards at 17, his body dragged through the streets, thrown into the Tiber, all because he dared to live differently, and publicly. Here's something scholars debate endlessly. Were these emperors truly depraved or just victims of hostile historians? Writers like Suetonius loved to scandalise. It made their work sell, so to speak. The problem is, the sources are often biased, written long after the emperors were dead, shaped by political spin. Maybe Nero didn't marry a castrated boy out of madness. Maybe it was grief power, or a warped idea of love. Maybe Caligula wasn't mad, just cruel. Or maybe they really were as unhinged as described, and the sources didn't even capture the half of it. There's no CCTV, just whispers scratched into papyrus. And what about the emperors who weren't remembered for scandal? Augustus, for instance, built his entire image around modesty and tradition. But even he was rumoured to have inspected young boys and girls before choosing his dinner companions. Tiberius, known for his withdrawn later years on the island of Capri, was said to have kept minnows, children trained to perform sexual acts underwater for his amusement. Horrifying, yes. Verifiable. Hard to say. But the image stuck, and maybe that's the most Roman thing of all. Sex, in the hands of emperors, wasn't just about pleasure. It was about control, domination, theatre. Whether they were indulging quietly or parading their lovers through the forum, emperors understood the power of erotic narrative. Sleep with a man? That's gossip. Be seen sleeping with a man? That's a political move. Take a senator's wife? That's a headline. Castrate a lover and call him your bride. That's an act of cultural rebellion with a side of trauma. Here's a quirky tidbit that puts it all into perspective. The Emperor Domitian, known for his cold demeanour, once passed a law making it illegal to castrate slaves, a move seen by many as oddly humane. And yet Domitian himself was deeply superstitious, terrified of prophecy, and allegedly slept with his niece before later executing her. Because even when they tried to legislate decency, Rome's rulers couldn't help but bend back toward darkness. So by the time you step out of the palace's shadow down its over-polished steps, you feel less like you've visited royalty and more like you've survived a fever dream. These weren't just rulers, they were cautionary tales draped in purple. Their appetites weren't just excessive, they were epic, grotesque, sometimes tragic, and always tangled up in power. In Rome, an emperor's bedroom was never just a bedroom, it was a stage, and what happened there could make, or unmake, an empire. You leave the echoing halls of the imperial palaces behind, letting the oppressive scent of burning myrrh and polished marble fade as you make your way down into the humbler, dustier quarters of the city, the alleyways, the workshops, the shared apartments of the insulae. And here, tucked between the vendors hawking honeycakes and the kids kicking a pig's bladder down the street, is where another truth about Roman sexuality flickers to life. Because for all its grand gestures and legal sermons, Rome had a surprisingly complex and evolving relationship with the same-sex attraction. And unlike what you may have heard, it wasn't just tolerated, it was structured, managed, and very, very Roman. Now, to be absolutely clear, the Romans didn't think about sexuality the way modern societies do. They didn't divide people neatly into straight or gay. They didn't argue about identities the way we do. What mattered wasn't who you desired, it was how you expressed that desire. And as always in Rome, that boiled down to power, status, role. If you were a freeborn Roman male, you were expected to dominate in all things, politics, business, and yes, sex. You could pursue women, of course, but also men, or rather boys. More specifically, younger males of lower status, slaves, freedmen, foreigners. The important thing was that you, the Roman citizen, were the active partner, the penetrator. To receive was to submit, and submission was not considered masculine. So a male citizen sleeping with another man wasn't scandalous, unless he was on the receiving end. Then, social death. That's where things get sticky. There were specific insults for men who were too soft, too willing, too pretty. Words like Sinaeus and Pathicus were hurled like daggers in the street. terms that implied not just sexual passivity, but moral weakness, effeminacy, a lack of control. Martial, Rome's snarkiest poet, laced his epigrams with them. If you wore your toga too loose, had your hair curled, or showed too much thigh at the baths, someone would inevitably make assumptions. This is where gender expression comes into the mix. Rome allowed for a broad range of behaviour behind closed doors, as long as the outward image of masculinity remained intact. A man could visit a brothel and hire a male prostitute. He could keep a beautiful slave boy for pleasure. He could even fall in love with a man, write poetry, weep about it. But if he let that affection change him, if he got too emotional, too submissive, too stylised, then he risked being seen not as romantic, but weak. Too much Greekness, the Romans would say. That was the insult. They blamed the Greeks for everything soft, sensual, or intellectually decadent. Which is ironic, because Roman culture borrowed liberally from Greek homoerotic traditions. Philosophers like Plato had long written about the virtues of same-sex love, about male bonds that were intellectually, spiritually, and yes, physically profound. Roman elites, especially those trained in Greek literature, absorbed those ideas. Some embraced them, others mocked them. It depended on who was watching. One of the more curious practices was pederasty, the socially accepted mentorship-style relationship between an older man, Erastes, and a younger one, Eromenos. In Greece, this was often formalised, ritualised, even idealised. In Rome, less so. While young male slaves were often targets of older men's affections or exploitation, it wasn't framed as a noble bond, it was about access and power. A man could have a boy, but he wasn't supposed to care too much. Sentimentality was suspicious, and yet it happened. Love bloomed in unlikely places, in letters, in poetry, in stolen moments. In fact, some Roman graffiti hints at this. Scribbled in a tavern, "I love Felix and he loves me." Another, more pleading, "Come back, Lucius, my bed is cold." These weren't just jokes, they were snapshots of longing, written not for history books, but for hearts. The Emperor Hadrian, arguably one of the more dignified rulers, had a famous love affair with a Greek youth named Antinous. Unlike the crude obsessions of earlier emperors, this one seemed tender. When Antinous died, under mysterious, probably tragic circumstances, Hadrian was devastated. He deified the boy, built statues, named cities after him, commissioned temples. It wasn't just mourning, it was an act of imperial love immortalised in marble. Even cynical Roman observers couldn't fully sneer at that. It was grief on a divine scale. Still, not everyone got the Hadrian treatment. Most same-sex relationships stayed hidden in private rooms, in coded poetry, or among the working-class spaces where rules relaxed. Male prostitutes, called exoleti or synaedi depending on who was describing them, were common in brothels. Some were flamboyant, some were discreet, some were young boys rented out by parents or masters. The line between work and abuse was razor-thin. One historical oddity? The Lex Scantinia, a vague Roman law that supposedly punished adult men who engaged in illicit acts with freeborn male youths. But the law was rarely enforced and usually only dragged out during political feuds when someone needed a reason to drag a rival through the mud. Accuse a senator of violating the law and you might not convict him, but you'd stain his name. That was enough. Scholars today debate how open Roman same-sex culture really was. Some argue that it was largely repressed, that the fear of being labelled passive kept most men tightly guarded. Others point to the sheer volume of erotic art, graffiti, and literature and say, clearly, same-sex desire was woven into Roman life, it just had to play by different rules. The truth is probably both. Rome was a society obsessed with order, and so even love had to obey its rankings. But there were always those who didn't care, who loved anyway, who stepped outside the lines. We have fragments of their stories, letters carved into brick, scribbled declarations, poems, mourning inscriptions on gravestones with two male names side by side sharing a date. Were they friends, lovers, brothers? The record doesn't always tell us, but the heart reads between the lines. Here's a quirky little note. Phallic amulets weren't just symbols of fertility or protection. In some cases, they were worn by men who wanted to signal availability, to both genders. It's subtle, but if you were looking, you'd know. Rome had its signals, its codes, its glances across the bathhouse steam. Everyone had a role, the bold played with it. As you move through the crowds again, you realise same-sex relationships in Rome weren't a hidden world. They were a parallel one. Visible to those who looked closely, ignored by those who preferred decorum. Desire didn't care about class or gender, but Rome did, so every love had to pick its place in the hierarchy, or risk being crushed by it. You step into the side streets now, past herb sellers and bead stalls, past the scent of roasted pine nuts and sharp vinegar wine, until you reach something that looks, well, surprisingly cute. A little wooden stall tucked into a crowded market, crammed with tiny objects, charms, trinkets, carved stones, miniature dolls, phallic pendants, and strange knotted cords. Welcome to the world of Roman sexual amulets and love magic, where desire didn't just smoulder behind doors but got bottled, tied, burned, buried, and worn around your neck like a secret weapon. Because in a city where sex was everywhere, people didn't just chase passion, they tried to control it. Let's start with the basics. Romans were deeply superstitious. Every cough, sneeze, or twitch in your left eye had meaning. Naturally, when it came to something as volatile as love and lust, they turned to the supernatural, and nothing says I love you like a lead curse tablet buried under your crush's front step. Yes, curse tablets. Called defictiones, these were thin sheets of lead inscribed with prayers, threats, or magical instructions, sometimes folded, pierced with nails, and buried in graves or wells. The idea was to bind someone, to freeze their affections, punish a rival, or make a desired person fall hopelessly into your arms. One surviving tablet reads, "May Tertius not be able to eat, sleep, or make love with anyone but me." Another says, "Blind her eyes, twist her insides, let her burn with longing." Subtle? Not at all. Effective? That depends who you ask. Many of these were love spells, but just as many were about revenge. The line between erotic obsession and pure malice was thin. If your lover left you, you didn't cry into a pillow. You scribbled down their name, called on Mercury or Pluto, or some local underworld spirit, and buried that pain in the dirt, along with a fingernail clipping or a lock of hair if you were going full hardcore. The Romans didn't just feel love, they weaponized it. But that's just one side of the coin. On the other end were the charms of attraction, the aphrodisiac amulets. These were lighter, flirtier, and usually a little cheeky. A common example, the fascinum, the ever-present Roman phallus, turned into a pendant, door ornament, or wind chime. Some were simple, others had wings or little feet. You'd find them dangling from necklaces, sewn into children's clothing, carved into walls. Yes, children's clothing. Because they weren't considered sexual in the modern sense, they were protective. Symbols of virility, energy, life force. But depending on who was wearing it and how, it could send a very different message. There were vulva-shaped charms too, though far less common. Some were carved into small objects and slipped into pouches with herbs, meant to draw a lover's attention or enhance fertility. Others were baked into cakes for weddings, hidden among the raisins like a sexy fortune cookie. A bride might wear a charm to ensure her husband's desire never waned, or that it returned if it had already started to wander. Which, let's be honest, was probably happening before the wedding wine was even poured. And then there were potions. Aphrodisiacs were big business in the ancient world. You've got your expected ones, oysters, honey, anise, wine. But then things get weird. Goat bile, ground up lizard tails, wolf tooth powder, even Spanish fly, a bright beetle that was ground into a burning hot paste and mixed into the drinks. It caused blisters, irritation, and occasionally death. But hey, no risk, no romance, right? Roman medical writers like Pliny and Galen catalogued dozens of recipes for arousal and fertility. Some involved rubbing mixtures onto the thighs, others were to be swallowed, others still were burned as incense while reciting incantations. One especially charming recipe advised men to carry a dried mouse in a leather pouch during sex to ensure stamina. Another recommended boiling onions in donkey de milk for a pre-intercourse tonic. If that doesn't scream irresistible, nothing will. But magic wasn't just for lovers. Jealous spouses used it too. A woman might hang a charm over her door to keep rival women away. A man might sneak a cursed object under his wife's bed if he suspected infidelity, or just wanted to keep her docile. The overlap between sex, control, and the supernatural was constant. When trust failed, magic stepped in. You'll even find references to love magic in Roman literature. In Ovid's Amoras, he jokes about women tying love knots and mixing secret potions. In The Golden Ass by Apuleius, we get a more sinister look. A witch seduces, manipulates, and curses with erotic spells, turning desire into destruction. These stories both mocked and acknowledged a cultural truth. Romans believed in this stuff. Maybe not always literally, but emotionally. Magic gave them a way to express fear, hope, and longing in a world ruled by hierarchy and law. Here's a quirky twist for you. Some love spells were written backward, or in magical gibberish, not because the gods preferred gibberish, but because it added a layer of mystery. The harder it was to read, the more powerful it felt. Some even included strings of nonsense syllables, like magical passwords. Abracadabra has roots in ancient charms. And yes, people paid for these. They bought them in markets, from street magicians, old women with wrinkled hands and too many teeth, or shady scribes who promised results by the next full moon. And of course there were scams. You knew that already. Not all love charms were made with divine intervention. Some were just a clever way to charge desperate people for herbs and shiny trinkets. A lovesick merchant hands over a coin for a guaranteed seduction spell, only to discover it's just crushed mint and beetroot juice. But in a way, it still works. Belief was part of the magic. Scholars debate how seriously Romans took all this. Was it mainstream? Fringe? Most agree it was somewhere in the middle. The educated elite scoffed publicly at love magic, but many of them also quietly hired someone to curse a rival or boost their bedroom luck. Even the Emperor Augustus had magical protections placed in his home, including phallic charms above the doors and secret inscriptions to ward off envy. Because when it came to power and pleasure, no one wanted to leave anything to chance. As you step back into the sunlight, one of those little charms dangling from your fingers like a forgotten souvenir, you realise something strange. Rome didn't separate sex from spirituality. They overlapped, intertwined. Lust was divine, dangerous, delicate. And if you couldn't earn someone's love with status or poetry, you could always bury a spell under their garden path and hope the gods, or ghosts, answered. You find yourself on a quiet rooftop now, looking out over terracotta tiles, clotheslines, and chimneys puffing lazy trails of smoke into the early evening sky. The noise of the forum fades beneath you, the clatter and politics and all that performative Roman virtue. Up here, it's a little different, a little more daring, because you're about to meet the rarest figures in Rome's erotic landscape. Women who actually took control. Not quietly, not politely, not in the shadows, but boldly, with strategy, sometimes scandal, and more than a little sass. Tonight, we're lifting the curtain on the women who flipped the script. Let's start with a reality check. Roman society wasn't built to let women steer the wheel, especially not sexually. The model woman was modest, obedient, married by 14, and ideally splendid unless she was naming herbs or instructing a slave. But of course, people are people. And some women weren't interested in playing parts written by crusty old senators with bad sandals and worse opinions. Take Fulvia. She wasn't just a power player, she was a political hurricane. She married 3 men, all influential, including Mark Antony. While her political influence is usually the headline, Fulvia also had a personal reputation for being, let's say, unapologetically involved. One story claims she had the severed head of Cicero brought to her and, just for fun, pierced his tongue with a hairpin, possibly the same one she'd used in her coif that morning. Was it revenge? Performance? Either way, it screams, I am not your typical Roman matron. Then there's Clodia Metelli. Yes, that Clodia, the one who broke Catullus's heart and possibly poisoned a man or two. She was so literate, fiercely intelligent, and unafraid to love loudly. In a world where most women had to sneak around to see lovers, Clodia just walked into the forum and dared anyone to stop her. She hosted salons, she quoted Greek poetry, she flirted in public, she was accused of sleeping with her brother, bribing politicians and running an underground club of aristocratic hedonists. Are all those things true? Probably not. But people believed them because they could imagine her doing it, and that alone made her dangerous. But it wasn't just elite women bending the rules. Freedwomen and sex workers sometimes managed to carve out their own kind of independence, economic and erotic. Some owned property, others ran their own taverns or brothels, a few even managed to retire with wealth and lovers of their choosing. One inscription from a freedwoman named Glycera reads like a mic drop. She lived as she pleased, loved as she pleased, and owed no man a debt. That's not just empowerment, it's rebellion etched in stone. Still, the most intriguing cases were women who operated within the rules, barely, but used them like knives. Agrippina the Younger, Nero's mother, was a master of this. She played the perfect Roman widow, modest veil, sad eyes, maternal concern. But behind the scenes, she orchestrated alliances, seduced powerful men, and manoeuvred her son onto the throne. According to some sources, she even offered herself to her son as a way to control him sexually. Is that true? Maybe, maybe not. But again, the rumour worked because she was already terrifyingly competent. And competence in a Roman woman was always suspect. One curious tool of control: literacy. Roman women weren't supposed to read or write fluently. That was for scribes, poets, and men who liked to show off their Greek. But the women who could write letters, poems, love notes, held power over men who weren't used to being outversed. Sulpicia, whose poetry still survives, didn't ask for permission to love. She just wrote, I am no ashamed to admit it. I chose him, and I delight in that choice. It's not a whisper, it's a roar, dipped in ink. Now, scholars will debate endlessly. Were these women exceptions, or do they hint at a broader undercurrent? Some argue they were rare outliers, unique and privileged. Others suggest that more Roman women were subverting expectations all the time, just more discreetly. After all, power doesn't always look like marching into the Senate. Sometimes it looks like choosing who to let into your bed and why. Even fashion could be a form of rebellion. The standard Roman woman wore a stola, a long, modest garment that practically screamed, "I'm respectable." But some women abandoned the stola for the more revealing Greek-style tunics. This wasn't just a wardrobe choice, it was a statement. Roman men lost their minds over it. Poets accused them of promiscuity, moralists clutched their scrolls, but the women didn't stop. Some wore perfume heavily, some painted their cheeks. These weren't random choices, they were signals. I am not here to be quiet. Let's talk about Roman cosmetics for a second. While the average matron might apply a bit of rouge with crushed rose petals, bolder women experimented with elaborate hair dyes, saffron eyeshadow, and lip colour made from mulberries or, disturbingly, cinnabar, a toxic mercury compound. They wore jewellery that jingled, cloaks in rich purple tones normally reserved for aristocrats, and snake-patterned sandals. They weren't dressing for subtlety, they were dressing like they owned the damn street. Here's a quirky footnote. In some cases, Roman women wrote their names above their lovers on graffiti, a reversal of the usual order. It seems like nothing, right? But in a world that treated women's names as private, almost sacred, writing it publicly and boldly, especially linked to a romantic conquest, was an act of defiance. "I love Secundus," reads one wall. "He is mine. Not beloved by or sought by, just mine." That's the whole game right there. Even inside marriages, women could find subtle ways to assert control. They learned how to manipulate inheritance laws, how to secure property through carefully worded wills, how to maneuver alliances through their children. A clever Roman matron could turn her home into a fortress of quiet influence. She might not be able to vote, but she could decide who got her daughter's hand. She could shape the next generation of Rome, one subtle word at a time. Of course, these acts of power came with consequences. Women who stepped too far out of line were smeared as nymphomaniacs, witches, or traitors. Roman literature is full of panicked warnings about the woman who reads too much, talks too much, or wants too much. But the fear itself, that's proof of the threat. If Rome had truly believed women were powerless, it wouldn't have worked so hard to keep them in line. By the time you step down from that rooftop, the light fading into the kind of soft orange that makes every scandal seem like a legend, you realise something. Roman women were never just scenery. Some endured, some escaped, some seduced, some ruled, and some did all of it without ever asking permission. Now take a deep breath. Not a metaphorical one, a real one, because the air's about to change. You're walking downhill now through Rome's grimiest streets, where the stone is slick with spilled wine, and who knows what else. The perfume of Venus has given way to the sharper scent of sweat, smoke, and cheap oil lamps. You're heading into the red light district, Rome Subura, and tonight you're stepping inside the Lupanar, the brothel where the realities of sex were carved into stone and priced by the hour. Let's just say up front, Roman brothels weren't coy. The word Lupanar literally means wolf den, and prostitutes were often called lupae, she-wolves. Whether that's empowering or dehumanizing depends on how you look at it. But the metaphor stuck. And if you're imagining a shadowy building tucked discreetly into a back alley, think again. These places were loud, bold, and sometimes even advertised their services with pictures and graffiti right outside the door. The idea of privacy? That belonged to the upper classes. Step inside. The rooms are tiny, cramped, and shockingly uniform. Stone platforms barely wide enough for two, covered in straw or worn linen if you were lucky. The walls are decorated with frescoes showing various sexual positions, not as pornography, but as a kind of menu. Some art historians still debate whether these were meant to guide the customer or simply titillate, but most agree you were here to do business, and you knew what kind of business the moment you walked in. The women, and sometimes men working in these rooms, weren't just standing behind curtains waiting to be summoned. They were active participants in a cutthroat economy. Most were enslaved. Some were freed women trying to earn enough to stay independent. A few were born into the trade. They adopted aliases, often playful or exotic, Clytemnestra, Lupa, Maritima. Others went by nicknames like All-Night Girl or Fast Hands. These names were tools, brand identities, if you will. Services were direct, no small talk, payment was upfront, usually in the form of a few copper coins. A standard session might cost between 2 and 8 asses. Yes, that was the actual name of the currency, and no, you're not wrong to laugh. Which was roughly the price of a loaf of bread or a cup of cheap wine. For extra services, or more time, you'd pay more. For wealthier clients, or those with very specific tastes, prices could skyrocket. And while some patrons came with coin, others came with favours. Brothel workers might accept goods, protection, gossip, or even influence in place of cash. After all, in a city powered by secrets, information was its own currency. Now, here's a detail that sounds like it's from a bad soap opera. Brothel workers often carved reviews into the walls, things like, "Felix had me 3 times in one night, very strong," or "Maritima will not give change. Beware, think of it as Yelp for the ancient world." Others etched crude poetry, threats, or confessions. One reads, "I've fallen in love with Theodora. May she take me for free just once." Another simply says, "I came twice." Succinct, honest. Not all sex work happened in Lupinaria, of course. Streetwalkers and tavern girls often did business out of wine shops, bathhouses, or alleyway doorways. These makeshift workplaces were less protected and often far more dangerous. Some workers marked their territory with symbols, phallic chalk drawings, coded gestures, even coloured sashes. And many kept an eye out for police. Not because sex work was illegal, but because disrupting public order was. If things got too loud, too violent, or too visible, the authorities might crack down. Not out of morality, but out of concern for Rome's carefully curated appearance. There's still debate over how much autonomy any of these workers had. Some were managed by lenones, or pimps, who took a cut, or all of their earnings. Others were owned outright by brothel keepers, working long hours with no control over clients, health, or even their own bodies. A few women, though, seem to have risen above it, buying their freedom, starting their own establishments, or partnering with other freedmen. One inscription in Ostia honours a woman named Faustina, who not only ran a profitable brothel but left a will distributing her wealth to her children. It's a rare bright spot in a world that generally didn't care what happened to women who served behind a door with no lock. Even the architecture of brothels tells a story. Many had small windows overlooking the street, not for light but for advertisement. Others had back doors for discreet exits, or for clients who didn't want to be seen entering. Some featured communal latrines mere feet from the working rooms. There was nothing luxurious here. No velvet, no incense, just cold stone, creaking wood, and the quiet math of profit. And don't think for a second that only men visited brothels. While male customers dominated, there are enough references in Roman writing to suggest women occasionally sought out sex workers too. Sometimes male, sometimes female. Martial jokes about a rich widow sneaking off to visit a gladiator she fancied. Juvenile rails against lustful women who chase men in the street like drunken satyrs. Are they exaggerating? Of course, but the implication is there. Desire wasn't one-sided, even if the stories usually were. So what did the average brothel experience feel like? Probably fast, transactional, and gritty. But maybe not entirely joyless. Some clients fell for workers, some workers developed affections for regulars, relationships of a sort formed. There are love inscriptions on brothel walls. "Lucilla, my star. Sabina is the sweetest." Were they real? Were they honest? Who knows? But they existed. Here's a quirky side note. Some Roman brothels had rooms with raised stone platforms and built-in footrests, possibly for better leverage. This wasn't just utility, it was intended. Even Roman engineering got involved in the pursuit of profit and pleasure. Say what you will about the empire, it was efficient. By the time you walk back out into the street past the flickering oil lamps and the unmistakable thwap-thwap of sandals on stone, your head spins a little. Not from shock, but from the sheer bluntness of it all. Rome didn't hide its sex workers. It taxed them, it mocked them, it used them, it wrote about them in satire and carved their names into stone. Their lives were transactional, yes, often cruel, sometimes dangerous, but also undeniably real. In a city built on conquest, not everyone wielded a sword. Some held a coin purse, some wore a red sash, some carved their name into a wall and dared history to remember them. You step away from the Lupana now, blinking off the afterimage of low ceilings, stone beds, and oil-slick shadows. The street outside feels fresher somehow, if only by comparison. You move uphill again toward Rome's commercial heart, the markets, the porticos, the places where everyone from senators to slaves crossed paths. But you're not here for grain or sandals. You're here to look at people, specifically what they wore. Because in Rome, fashion wasn't just flair, it was a language. And when it came to sex, clothing did more than hint. It announced. So tonight, we're undressing the dress code. How Romans dressed to impress, to seduce, or to signal something a little more illicit. Let's start with the stola. This was the Roman matron's uniform. Modest, stately ankle length. Worn over a tunic, often belted beneath the bust, and accompanied by the palla, a draped shawl worn over the head or shoulder. It said, "I'm respectable, I'm married, and no, I'm not available." Stolas were made of wool, the humbler homegrown option, and dyed in muted tones, earthy reds, creams, ochres. No one was showing off. This was an outfit designed to disappear into good behaviour. But that's just the front row. The real fashion signals were happening in the layers beneath, and on the margins. A woman who went without a stola or wore her tunic too short was making a statement. Maybe she was a meretrix, a sex worker, required by a law to wear distinguishing garments. Or maybe she was just flirting with scandal. A red or purple tunic could suggest boldness, confidence, maybe a little danger. Gold thread? Risky. Too much jewellery? Obvious. Too little? Possibly deceptive. Roman women walked a tightrope, always balancing between propriety and allure. For unmarried women, the instator, a kind of decorative hem, was used to show their virginal status. But once married, that went away. You were now part of the wife class, and yet some wives kept their instator longer than they should have, claiming innocence even as they exchanged glances across the atrium. It was like wearing a wedding ring and pretending you're single, visually plausible, morally questionable. Meanwhile, men weren't exactly throwing on whatever tunic was closest to the bed. Their clothing choices were equally loaded. The classic tunic, knee-length, belted and wool, was standard daily wear. Senators wore tunics with a broad purple stripe, while equestrians had narrower ones. The toga, though, that was for formal occasions, politics, ceremonies, and absolutely not for relaxing. It was stiff, awkward, and took assistance to put on properly. Wearing a toga in casual settings made you look ridiculous or performative, unless, of course, you were making a statement. Enter the toga muliebris, the women's toga. Here's where it gets weird. Respectable Roman women didn't wear togas. If you were seen in one, it usually meant you'd been stripped of your matron status, either by law or scandal. Adulteresses and prostitutes were said to wear togas as a mark of shame or legal classification. This garment, once the symbol of citizenship, could also become a social scarlet letter. So imagine the message a woman sent by choosing to wear one. Defiance, or at least a knowing shrug toward her reputation. And then there was the hair. Roman women's hairstyles were as complicated as their social roles. A tightly braided chignon signalled modesty and order. But add a few curls, some volume, maybe a little imported blonde wig from Germania. Suddenly you're sending a different message. Extravagance. Ambition. Sexual confidence. Women in the imperial court had entire staff dedicated to their hairstyles, which could reach towering heights, literally, woven with pearls, gold wire, even tiny sculpted pins, shaped like animals, birds, or certain anatomical features. It was art, but it was also a billboard. Roman men weren't above grooming games either. A beard could signal mourning, but also Greek affectation. Clean-shaven was standard for much of Roman history, especially among the upper class. It implied discipline, self-control, and access to personal slaves who shaved you without nicking your jugular. But during certain imperial reigns, hello Hadrian, beards came back in style, often signalling intellectualism or a connection to Greek culture. Whether that was sexy depends on your type, but at the very least it suggested thoughtfulness, or someone trying very hard to appear thoughtful. Now let's talk nudity, because in Roman art bodies were everywhere, muscled, idealised, often heroic, but in daily life nudity was heavily context dependent. In the baths, normal. In the bedroom, expected. In the forum, absolutely not, unless you were being punished. Nakedness wasn't inherently erotic, but public nakedness was always political. Even exposing your chest could be a protest, especially for women. Vestal virgins, for example, were expected to remain covered at all times. A flash of skin from one of them wasn't just scandalous, it was blasphemous. Then there were erotic accessories. Some of these were subtle. A love charm tucked into a sleeve, a small phallic pendant worn beneath the tunic, scented oils rubbed into the wrists and behind the ears. Others were not. High-class courtesans might wear sheer fabrics imported from the East, diaphanous silks that left little to the imagination. One poet describes a woman's gown as being woven of whispers, an absolutely delicious way of saying basically see-through. Here's a quirky fashion trend you might not expect. Some Roman men wore breastplates not into battle but into bed. Erotic ones, decorated with phallic imagery or Venus symbols designed to play into performance. Sex as theatre. And while that may sound ridiculous, it was taken seriously enough to warrant high craftsmanship. If you're wondering how that works logistically, so are scholars. One more strange fact, the use of colour in undergarments. Most Romans didn't wear much beneath their tunics, maybe a subligaculum, a kind of loincloth or simple wrap. But some women, especially those performing in erotic dances or banquets, wore red or black underthings as part of the tease. A flash of red beneath a cream tunic was deliberate. A bit of black silk caught in the torchlight could be the ancient version of a lace bra strap, suggestive, fleeting, entirely intentional. Scholars today are still puzzling over how much fashion functioned a sexual signalling in Rome versus just style? Was a golden brooch a love lure, or just a nice accessory? Did a sheer veil mean seduction, or was it just a hot day? But when you look at the full picture, paired with poetry, lore and graffiti, it's hard to believe clothing was just about comfort. Romans didn't do subtle very well. If something had a social meaning, it usually had a second meaning tucked in there too, like a joke only your friends would get. As you step back into the city's steady pulse, you can't help but glance at the people walking past. That man's stripe is too wide for his station. That woman's palette is slipping off her shoulder just a little too easily. Are they sending signals, or just badly dressed? In Rome you never really knew, but you watched anyway. You're moving a little slower now, the city heat pressing down like a heavy curtain, and your feet aching just a bit from all this time travelling. You duck into a shaded portico, hoping for a breeze, and end up in the company of someone you wouldn't normally think of when talking about sex. A Roman doctor, or maybe a philosopher. Either way, he's holding a scroll, lecturing quietly to a few scribes about fluids, humours, and why too much sex makes your spleen shrivel. Tonight, we're diving into the gloriously awkward, surprisingly detailed, often hilariously wrong world of Roman medical beliefs and aphrodisiacs, where science meets libido, and common sense quietly steps out the door. Let's start with the basics. Roman medicine was built on a foundation of Greek theory, especially the humoral system, the belief that the body was governed by 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health was about balance, imbalance caused illness, and sexual activity, that was a full-body event. According to thinkers like Galen, sex could either restore harmony or destroy it, depending on how you did it, how often, with whom, and whether Mercury was in retrograde. For men, ejaculation was considered a literal loss of vitality. Too much sex could weaken your knees, dull your eyesight, and shrink your testicles. On the other hand, too little sex caused build-up, resulting in melancholy, aggression, and in extreme cases, madness. A blocked man, as one writer put it, could become anxious and ungovernable. The medical solution? Regular solar, controlled release. Not too often, not too rarely. Like olive oil. Drizzle, don't drown. Women, of course, were seen as even more complicated. The Roman medical world operated under the firm belief that the female body was not only mysterious, but hysterical. Literally. The uterus was thought to be a wandering organ, floating freely inside the abdomen, occasionally pressing on the lungs or liver, and causing everything from fainting to depression. Too much sexual inactivity, they believed, caused the uterus to become dry or restless. This wandering womb theory was popular for centuries. The cure? Sex, or more accurately orgasm. But here's the twist. They believed both partners had to climax for conception to happen, which meant Roman doctors, many of whom were men, thought it was medically necessary for women to finish. Progressive? Sure, if only they hadn't also used that logic to justify marital coercion. A Roman midwife, or obstetrix, had a completely different toolkit than her male counterpart. She relied on herbs, hands, and years of watching women labour on reed mats while neighbourhood dogs barked outside. Some of these women knew their stuff, others handed out remedies that sound more like witchcraft. Soot from burned deer antlers, wolf urine, snake skin mixed with honey, applied directly or taken in wine. Aphrodisiacs, contraceptives and abortifacients were part of the kit, passed down from woman to woman in whispers and side glances. Some methods were terrifying. One birth control remedy involved inserting a small sponge soaked in acacia and vinegar into the vagina before intercourse. Did it work? Possibly. Acacia contains compounds that might have some spermicidal effect. But Roman doctors didn't care about the chemical details. They cared about balance, about keeping the body moist, but not too moist. Open, but not too open. You see the problem. Then there were the edible aphrodisiacs. Oysters, of course, have been on the list since forever. But Romans also swore by onions, asparagus, pepper, ginger, and, oddly, raw cabbage. Cabbage was thought to enhance male stamina and reduce post-coital fatigue. One poet joked that the only thing more reliable than cabbage in bed was Mercury himself. On the opposite end, lettuce was considered dangerous. Cool, damp, and effeminizing. Real men didn't eat lettuce. They devoured garlic, drank goat milk, and carried talismans shaped like penises. And there were plenty of talismans. Amulets made from coral, amber, or jet, worn to boost desire or ward off impotence. One common method involved etching erotic spells onto wax figures, tiny dolls of you and your desired partner, then melting them together over coals while chanting a rhyme. It was less 50 Shades, more Build-A-Bear meets black magic. Still, if your crush started blushing whenever you were near, maybe it worked. Or maybe it was the wine. But not all advice was sensual. Some Roman doctors were just plain killjoys. They warned against too much passion, especially for the elderly. Galen thought that older men risked literal death if they pushed themselves too hard in bed. He advised moderation, bland food, and long walks. He also recommended frequent enemas to keep your sex life healthy, because nothing says I love you like colon irrigation. One Roman writer, Celsus, offered a whole list of symptoms for what we'd now call erectile dysfunction, though he put it more delicately: the failure of the member to rise with intention. His treatments ranged from warming poultices to gentle stimulation with hands, scented oils, and a positive attitude. It's hard to say whether any of it worked, but the positive attitude part is at least timeless. Here's a particularly strange one: a recipe for a love potion involving roasted wolf liver and the ashes of a burned beehive ground into powder and mixed with your lover's spittle. You were supposed to carry the mixture in a pouch made from dolphin hide and wear it close to your heart. Did it smell good? Almost certainly not. Did it work? No idea. But again, belief was the real ingredient. And what about dreams? The Romans paid close attention to them, especially erotic ones. Dreaming of a lion was a sign of virility. Dreaming of being chased while naked? A warning of infidelity. One Roman dream interpreter claimed that dreaming of fire in your bed meant your partner was cheating. Another said it simply meant you were overdue for sex. Either way, your bedroom suddenly becomes a crime scene, or a fire hazard. Scholars today try to make sense of all this by pointing out that ancient medicine wasn't just biology, it was world view. The body was a microcosm of the universe. The planets affected your fluids affected your moods affected your love life. It was all connected, messy, and mostly wrong, but at the heart of it was a very human hope, that we could fix our hearts and our loins with enough goat milk and mint oil. You leave the portico with a chuckle and a little more sympathy for the poor Roman trying to balance their libido with 4 bodily humours and a dream about fire. Sex wasn't just pleasure, it was danger, medicine, magic, and sometimes cabbage. You're heading out past the city gates now, where the air smells less like incense and sewage and more like cypress trees and distant pastures. It's calmer here. The crowd's thin. The sound of sandals on stone fades into the buzz of cicadas and the faint, rhythmic clank of tools from a vineyard nearby. You're no longer in the beating heart of Rome. You're in its quiet lungs, the countryside, the villas, the provinces. And while Sex in the City gets all the headlines, tonight you're exploring what it looked like in the rural corners of the empire. Spoiler, it wasn't all sheep and serenity. Start with the villa. A wealthy Roman's country estate wasn't just a retreat, it was a power centre. Land was everything. A villa was where politics got smoothed over with wine, where alliances were forged in bathhouses, and where more privately, a whole other version of Roman intimacy unfolded. Away from the gaze of the Senate and the gossip-hungry crowds, Roman elites could indulge in behaviours that might have been risky or scandalous back home. And yet this version of pleasure was less about decadence and more about control. Still deeply structured, still about hierarchy. The paterfamilias, head of the household, ruled the villa like a personal kingdom. Every person within those stone walls, from his wife to his enslaved workers, existed under his authority. That meant sexual access too, and out here, where the scrutiny was lighter, stories hint at masters exercising that access more freely and more quietly. Female slaves were often chosen to share the master's bed after a long day in the fields. Some were even raised and trained for that purpose. Their lives were not glamorous, it wasn't poetry, it was obligation, and usually expected to be discreet. Yet occasionally discretion wasn't the point. Villa gardens featured statuary just as explicit as anything in the city. Stone pan figures chasing nymphs, Priapus with his infamous, well, let's just say, standing invitation. Rural religion was entwined with fertility in the most literal sense. Farmers didn't just pray for rain, they prayed for bountiful wombs, healthy animals, and thriving crops, all part of the same divine equation. And so fertility festivals were both spiritual and sexual. In Etrurian border towns, men and women danced naked in spring rituals, mimicking intercourse, form of symbolic planting. Sex a sacrament, wrapped in wine-soaked tradition. Even the furniture had a story. In some villas, archaeologists have found bed frames carved with erotic scenes, not hidden away in bedrooms, but in guest quarters. These weren't shy people. They saw nothing wrong with decorating their relaxation spaces with images of couples mid-embrace or threesomes, or satyrs doing unspeakable things to goats. It was understood as natural, earthy, even celebratory. In their minds, sex and nature work together, no shame, just rhythm. That said, don't confuse rural for simple. While many country dwellers were poor, uneducated, or enslaved, some carried surprisingly sophisticated ideas about sex and love. Inscriptions found on provincial gravestones in places like Gaul and Hispania describe husbands weeping for wives lost in childbirth, lovers honouring their partners with poetry carved in local dialects. One particularly sweet tombstone from Britannia reads, "To my beloved Sylvana, who warmed my bed and lit my life." Not exactly Ovid, but there's something raw and real in that. And that brings us to provincial Rome, the edges of empire. Here, in places like Egypt, Syria, North Africa, and the frontier forts of Germania, Roman sexuality absorbed local flavours. Intermarriage was common. Roman soldiers took local wives or concubines. The gods of lust had different names and symbols, sometimes merging Venus with Isis or Aphrodite with native deities of love and motherhood. In Alexandria, erotic spells mixed Greek, Egyptian, and Hebrew traditions. In Dacia, love charms were made of hammered tin and worn on the wrist like bangles. The further you got from Rome, the looser the rules became. Not necessarily wilder, but different. In some border towns, women had more freedom to initiate relationships or own property, which gave them a level of autonomy rarely seen in the city. Temple priestesses sometimes doubled as sacred prostitutes, continuing ancient traditions that predated Roman rule. In parts of Asia Minor, cults of fertility goddesses held rituals that involved dancing, feasting, and yes, sometimes communal sex. Was it love? Not quite, but it was celebration, ritual, a release of tension before the harvest or after war. Of course, not everything was free-spirited. In the military camps along the Rhine or Danube, sex was more regimented, both literally and culturally. Soldiers couldn't legally marry during their service, but many kept camp wives, unofficial partners who lived just outside the fort. Some relationships were tender, others exploitative. Children born of these unions were often claimed by the father after discharge, though some were left behind entirely. It all depended on the man's conscience, or lack of one. A peculiar fact, in Germania, Roman soldiers often complained about local women being too tall, too loud, and too free with their opinions. Tacitus wrote about them with equal parts admiration and alarm. Meanwhile, Roman women described provincial men as barbaric but passionate. Translation, terrible table manners, great in bed. It's amazing how little that sort of review has changed in 2,000 years. And let's not forget the slaves who made these rural worlds run. In the countryside, enslaved people didn't just work. They lived entire lives largely invisible to history. And among them were love stories, quiet rebellions, moments of defiant joy. We find glimpses in graffiti carved into vineyard walls. Lucia loves Marcus, though he belongs to Domitius. Stolen kisses behind the granary. Simple, defiant acts of intimacy in places where freedom was a luxury. Some scholars argue that the provinces were places of more sexual fluidity than Rome itself, less burdened by tradition, more open to hybrid customs. Others believe the opposite, that Roman colonizers imposed their rigid morality on the locals, reshaping rituals to fit their system. The truth probably lies in between. There was resistance, assimilation, reinvention. As always, sex was the smoke that rose from deeper fires. Identity, power, fear, longing. By the time you sit beneath a lone olive tree, watching two farmhands walk by with arms full of grapes and stories, it hits you. Sex in Rome wasn't confined to silk sheets and palatial scandal. It lived here too, in the dirt, in the ritual, in the quiet look shared between two people who had nothing except each other and a moment out of sight. The empire was vast, but desire travelled well. It spoke every language, it touched every village. It changed with the soil, but it never stopped blooming. You're back in the city now, drawn once again toward its pulse, though your thoughts are still scattered like olive pits along the Appian Way. And just as you start thinking you've seen it all, brothels, bedroom rituals, imperial scandal, goat-based aphrodisiacs, you realise there's one last realm we haven't fully explored. A place where art imitates desire, and sometimes controls it. You slip into a shadowed corner of a wealthy home, past frescoes and mosaics, into a world where sex was painted, sculpted, inked, and staged. Tonight, you're entering the sensual psyche of ancient Rome through its art, literature, and performance. And if you think modern media is obsessed with sex, Rome is here to smirk knowingly. Let's begin with the walls. Roman domestic art wasn't subtle. You've already passed images of lovers mid-embrace on brothel walls, but even in upper-class villas, erotic imagery was everywhere. The House of the Veti in Pompeii, for instance, features frescoes of Priapus balancing his famously oversized endowment on a scale, weighing it against a bag of coins. It's as obvious as it sounds, and no, it wasn't hidden in a closet. It greeted visitors in the entrance hall as if to say, "Welcome, we're fun." You'd see couples in various positions, often inspired by myths. Leda and the Swan, Pan and the Goat, Venus and Mars. The art was meant to amuse, excite, maybe even impress. Look at how cultured we are. Look at what we get away with. In dining rooms, mosaics of Dionysian orgies were common. Bacchus, nymphs, satyrs, wild dances, limbs entangled in impossible shapes. It wasn't just decoration, it was invitation. Roman banquets could be sensual affairs, reclining on cushions, servants pouring wine, food eaten with fingers, music in the background. The artwork created atmosphere. It made lust feel philosophical. After all, if the gods were doing it, why shouldn't you? Even the small private spaces carried visual reminders. Oil lamps in the shape of lovers, pottery with graphic scenes, tiny bronze amulets with anatomical flair. One surviving gem, probably worn as a ring, depicts two figures in a pose that would make modern yoga instructors wince. Were these everyday household items? Absolutely! Romans didn't shy away from the physical, they aestheticized it. They made it pretty, clever, and sometimes hilarious. Then there was the literature. Erotic poetry was one of Rome's most indulgent genres. Part confession, part performance art, part social commentary. Ovid is the name you probably know. His Ars Amatoria, or Art of Love, was a kind of how-to guide for seduction. What to say, how to dress, when to strike. He advised readers to attend gladiator games and sit beside someone attractive so you could accidentally brush hands during a dramatic moment. Don't ignore her feet, he wrote. They tell the story her eyes won't. Not exactly subtle, and that was the point. Ovid didn't just glorify desire. He gave it rules, techniques, a structure. He treated seduction as a sport, but not everyone appreciated his literary libido. The Emperor Augustus eventually exiled him, citing a poem and a mistake. Most scholars believe the poem was Ars Amatoria, and the mistake, well, that's still debated. Possibly Ovid had insider knowledge of court scandal, or maybe Augustus just hated being outsexed on paper. Then there's Catullus, a poet less smooth and more emotionally chaotic. His poems to Lesbia, possibly Clodia, the elite bad girl we met earlier, are messy, needy, biting and raw. I hate and I love, he writes. Why do I do this, perhaps you ask? I don't know, but I feel it. And I'm tortured. It's hard to imagine a more millennial breakup text, but that's what makes it timeless. He's not writing from a throne, he's writing from a bar stool. Martial, on the other hand, took erotic poetry to a snarkier place. He wrote epigrams, short, cutting, dirty. He made jokes about everything. Impotent husbands, aging courtesans, premature ejaculation. Some of his lines are still too raunchy to quote in polite company. He weaponized sexuality for satire. If you were named in one of Martial's verses, chances were you'd lose social credit instantly. He made you famous, but never for the right restaurant reasons. Theatre too had its role. Roman comedy, especially the plays of Plautus and Terence, relied heavily on sex for laughs. Mistaken identities, cross-dressing, lusty old men chasing cunning courtesans, clever slaves manipulating their masters into ridiculous scenarios. The plots weren't subtle, the jokes weren't either. But the audience? They loved it. Sexual humour was universal and playwrights knew it. Even tragedies occasionally featured sexual drama. Incest, betrayal, seduction, revenge. It was all there. Passion was treated like fate, unrelenting and often destructive. Watching it unfold on stage let audiences purge their anxieties. It also reminded them, love is chaos, respectable in moderation, disastrous when unchecked. A less known but fascinating form of Roman performance was mimi, or erotic dance and pantomime. These weren't just sexy shows, they were art. Dancers performed mythological stories with suggestive gestures, often barely clothed or completely nude. Think burlesque meets silent film with a touch of sacred drama. Some of these performers became minor celebrities. Others were enslaved artists, forced into a role they never chose, but either way, their work left an impression. Scholars still argue whether Rome was obsessed with sex, or simply honest about it. Some say the flood of erotic imagery reveals a culture of decadence, especially in the late Empire. Others believe much of it was symbolic, about fertility, power, the life cycle. A good deal of erotic art, after all, lived in spaces tied to food, sleep, or death. It was about the body's vulnerability, its pleasures and endings, not just arousal, mortality. Here's a quirky little gem. Archaeologists once discovered a public latrine in Ostia with erotic graffiti carved into its walls. One simply read, "Lucia was here and she loved it." Another depicted two stick figures mid-coitus, labelled only, "Guess who?" Even the bathroom had a sense of humour. Rome didn't sterilise sex, it lived with it laughed at it mourned it. As you walk back out of that fresco-covered villa, the sunlight feels warmer, like it's bounced off a dozen painted thighs and cherubic butts. You realise the Romans didn't separate sex from art or art from daily life. It was all woven together, desire and storytelling, humour and longing. Erotic expression was a mirror, a weapon, a diary and a seduction, sometimes all at once. Rome didn't just think about sex, it documented it, painted it, performed it, scribbled it on walls. and in doing so left behind a portrait of humanity that's as messy, bold, and achingly familiar as your own reflection in the bathroom mirror at 2 a.m, phone in hand, debating whether to text your ex. You're still turning over the vivid images in your head, the wall paintings, the graffiti, the smirking poets, and you're half convinced you've finally reached the peak of Rome's erotic mountain. But no, there's one last place to visit, one more class of characters living right at the edge of propriety and spectacle. You follow the sounds of cheering now, loud and raw, echoing off marble and brick, the kind of roar you'd expect from a stadium. And you're not wrong. Welcome to the arena, where blood was only half the story, because tonight you're meeting the gladiators, sex symbols of ancient Rome, weapon in hand and loincloth optional. These weren't just killers. These were celebrities, fantasies, and in many cases, walking erotic currency. Let's set the scene. The Colosseum, massive, brutal, majestic, is Rome's most iconic symbol. Gladiators fought here, of course, but they also fought in smaller provincial arenas, at funerals, even in private gardens if your name happened to be Caligula. And while the violence always took centre stage, the erotic undercurrent was impossible to miss. These men were muscled, oiled, half naked. Their armour covered just enough to suggest what it didn't, and the contrast of beauty and danger was part of the appeal. The average gladiator was a slave or prisoner of war, trained in a ludus from school, and owned by a lanista, trainer/manager. Think of it like ancient UFC meets human trafficking. But here's where it gets weird. Despite being the lowest of the low socially, gladiators were some of the most desired men in Rome. Women carved their names into walls. Poets mocked upper-class wives for falling in love with these sweaty warriors. Juvenal wrote about Epia, a senator's wife who abandoned her families to follow her favourite gladiator to the provinces. He had a scar across his nose, Juvenal says, and she found it romantic. The erotic appeal wasn't just about muscles, it was about risk. Gladiators could die at any moment. Loving one was dangerous, transgressive, it broke all the rules, and that of course made it all the more delicious. Women weren't just drawn to gladiators, they were obsessed. Some wore jewellery engraved with their favourites' names, others sent letters or, according to one particularly judgmental writer, undergarments scented with perfume and laced with petals. Even elite women, those stola-clad paragons of modesty, were rumoured to sneak out at night just to get a glimpse of their chosen champion returning from the sands. And the gladiators, they played the part. Some courted attention, others used their fame to gain favours, lovers, even freedom. An inscription found in Pompeii reads, "Celadus the Thracian makes the girls sigh." Another name's Crescens, the net fighter of the night. These weren't just fighters, they were brand names. Erotic mascots with a body count. Of course, this went both ways. Some gladiators also developed romantic relationships, sometimes genuine, sometimes transactional, with men and women alike. In elite homes, a popular status symbol was having a retired gladiator serve as a personal guard or lover. They were proof of wealth and erotic taste, like a pet tiger, but warmer. And less bitey. Probably. But not everyone was enchanted. Roman moralists were scandalised by gladiator worship. The idea that a respectable woman could fall for someone so polluted was, to them, appalling. These men had killed. They had fought half naked in front of crowds. They were outsiders, barbaric. The whole arrangement challenged Rome's very ideas of status and sexual order. A gladiator loving a senator's wife? Unthinkable, unless you wrote it down and sold the story to a poet, in which case, absolutely marketable. Then there were the gladiatrices, female gladiators rare but real. They didn't appear in every arena, and their fights were usually treated as novelties or festival entertainment, but they existed. Some fought other women, others fought animals or men in mismatched duels. Roman writers didn't know what to do with them. Some fetishized them, bare-breasted warriors with wild hair and polished blades. Others mocked them as freaks. Either way, their presence alone was disruptive. A woman in a tunic was property, a woman in armour was a threat, and an erotic paradox. We don't have as many juicy inscriptions about gladiatrices, but we do know that one elite woman was buried with a plaque calling her a woman who fought as one of the bravest. Was it a compliment or a sly insult? Still debated. But the fact that her epitaph references her arena life at all suggests she was proud, or at least unashamed. Here's a particularly bizarre twist. Gladiator sweat was sold as an aphrodisiac. That's not poetic, it's historical. Vendors collected the sweat from post-fight rubdowns, sometimes mixed with the scrapings of the arena sand, and sold it in tiny vials to women as love potions or skincare. It was supposed to enhance beauty, virility, and, yes, inspire lust. Modern dermatologists would probably scream, but the ancient world said, "Rub this into your cheeks and he'll be yours forever." Meanwhile, gladiator blood was also prized, not just sexually, but spiritually. Some believed it could cure epilepsy, others thought it transmitted strength. Roman medicine, once again, just absolutely swinging for the fences. Scholars still debate how much of the gladiator as sex symbol persona was theatre, and how much was genuine cultural obsession. Were they really seen as lovers, or just living pornography? Were women truly abandoning their husbands for a few sweaty minutes with a net fighter? Or were poets just having fun? The answer is probably both. Reality and fantasy blurred heavily in Rome, especially when it came to desire. And what about the gladiators themselves? Their voices are largely lost. We know how others saw them, but not how they saw themselves. Did they feel powerful? Objectified? Terrified? Maybe all three. They were trapped in a system designed to use their bodies for violence and pleasure, but some leveraged that into love, fame, even fortune. Others didn't live long enough to find out. As you walk back into the quieter streets, the cheers still echoing faintly behind you, you realise something. The arena wasn't just blood and sand, it was a stage, and like every stage in Rome, it served two gods, Mars and Venus, violence and seduction, and sometimes they wore the same helmet. Gladiators didn't just make Rome cheer, they made it blush, and crave, and grieve. The night is thicker now. You can almost feel the heat rising off the stones as the city exhales beneath its flickering torchlight. Rome doesn't sleep easily. There's always a banquet dragging on, a dice game clattering in a dark courtyard, a whispered tryst under an ivy-covered archway. But you're heading somewhere quieter, a little more reflective. Not because the appetite is gone, but because the stakes are higher here. Tonight, you're stepping into Rome's temples, its sacred groves, and the shadowy spaces where sex and the divine entwined. This isn't just about pleasure anymore, it's about power, ritual, worship, and sometimes something darker. Let's start with the basics. The Romans were practical polytheists, gods for everything, from door hinges to thunderstorms. And yes, several deities were devoted entirely to love, lust, and fertility. Venus, of course, was the queen of it all. She wasn't just the goddess of beauty, she was the force behind desire itself, seduction, attraction, and the tangled chaos that followed. Her temples weren't prudish places. Offerings to Venus could include mirrors, perfumes, even intimate clothing. Worshippers didn't kneel in shame. They presented their desires openly, almost proudly, asking for blessings in love or luck in the bedroom. Then you had Priapus, the garden god with the most famous erection in history. If Venus ruled romance, Priapus ruled potency, crude, cheerful, impossible to ignore. His statues were placed in gardens not just for protection, but to inspire. Some were equipped with actual hinges, letting his wooden member swing like a gate. Offerings to Priapus included fruit, wine, and the occasional phallic loaf of bread. Subtlety wasn't the goal, fertility was. If you wanted your vineyard to thrive, or your libido, you asked Priapus for a little boost. But Roman religion wasn't always playful. Some rituals walked a razor's edge between devotion and discomfort. One of the most infamous? The cult of Magna Mater, also known as Cybele. Brought to Rome from Phrygia, modern-day Turkey, Cybele was a mother goddess, powerful and wild, often accompanied by her frenzied priesthood, the Galli. These were male priests who, in a state of ritual ecstasy, would castrate themselves and adopt feminine dress and identities. Their ceremonies included drumming, dancing, and loud, violent processions. Blood was common, so was erotic fervour. Romans didn't quite know what to do with them. Some viewed them as holy, others saw them as mad, but they tolerated the cult because Cybele was ancient, foreign, and undeniably powerful. The Galli weren't alone. Rome had other priesthoods with erotic overtones. The Vestal Virgins, for example, were tasked with maintaining the sacred fire of Vesta, goddess of the hearth. They were sworn to chastity for 30 years. Their purity was said to ensure Rome's survival. But the flip side, a Vestal who broke her vow was buried alive, literally. A symbolic death to maintain the city's moral structure. That kind of punishment tells you how seriously Rome tied sex to the fate of the state. And then there were the mystery cults, esoteric, often imported religions with secret initiations and symbolic sexual rituals. The cult of Isis, for instance, offered spiritual rebirth through rituals that included water, music, and some scholars believe symbolic sexual union. Was it literal? Sometimes. Other times it was metaphorical, using erotic imagery to signify transformation, submission to divine will, or merging with the sacred. In Mithraism, a male-only cult favoured by soldiers, initiation often involved symbolic death and rebirth, and though it lacked overt sexuality, the bonding between members had an intense, intimate charge. Brotherhood wasn't just political, it was almost erotic in its devotion. Perhaps the most infamous moment in Rome's religious sexual history was the Bacchanalian scandal of 186 BCE. The Bacchic cults, worshippers of Bacchus or Dionysus, had existed peacefully for years. Their rites involved music, wine, ecstatic dancing, and yes, sexual liberation. Men and women participated together, but the Senate, ever allergic to uncontrolled pleasure, decided things had gone too far. They cracked down hard. Thousands were arrested or executed. The official reason? Conspiracies, moral decay, possible rebellion. But the real threat wasn't swords, it was sex without supervision. Joy that didn't obey laws. Still, not all divine eroticism was structured. Ordinary Romans often made personal offerings to love gods in small home shrines. A young man might burn incense to Cupid before confessing his feelings. A woman might tie a small fabric token to a tree in a sacred grove, asking for fertility or relief from desire. One recovered tablet reads, "Venus, take this ache from me, or make him return." The language of prayer and lust was often the same: yearning, helplessness, hope. Even funerary spaces carried erotic echoes. Some tombs bear carvings of couples in bed, not just in life, but in eternal union. Erotic poetry was inscribed alongside epitaphs. One such verse reads, "She loved me with a fire no rain could quench. May we meet again beyond the veil still burning." Love wasn't something to be silenced in death. It was part of the legacy, a kind of immortality through desire. Here's an odd footnote. The god Matunus Tutunus, an obscure fertility deity, had a cult statue so obscene that it embarrassed even the Romans. It was said that brides would ride the phallic idol before their wedding night as a form of symbolic deflowering. Some scholars think this practice was ritual, others think it's just urban legend wrapped in gossip. Either way, the story survives, and that's telling. So how did the average Roman think about all this? Religion wasn't separate from life, it was life. Gods watched the bedroom as closely as they watched the battlefield. Pleasure could be sacred, lust could be prayer, and shame? That was cultural, not spiritual. The divine wasn't always clean. Sometimes it was messy, naked, loud, and drenched in wine. Of course, not every Roman was comfortable with this. As Christianity crept in during the later centuries, attitudes began to shift. Virginity became more sacred than sex. Desire became something to tame, not celebrate. Temples of Venus were replaced by churches of chastity. The gods who once cheered for lovers were quietly exiled. But for hundreds of years, Rome worshipped with its whole body. It prayed with touch, honoured gods with sweat, and believed deeply that love and lust were not sins, but sacred instincts. To lie with someone wasn't just pleasure, it was a way to touch the divine. And as you step out of that cool marble temple, the scent of incense still clinging to your tunic, the echo of drums fading behind you, you feel it, that shimmer of something ancient, the sense that someone, somewhere, is still whispering prayers into the dark, asking for love, or healing, or just one night of feeling wanted beneath the stars. And here you are, the final stretch. Rome has shown you everything, from its velvet couches to its graffiti-stained walls, its whispered love spells and public phallic statues, its elite scandals and sweaty amphitheatre thirst traps. You have seen its brothels, its temples, its dreams and delusions. So now, as you walk a quieter street lit only by the glow of oil lamps and the hush of a late Roman hour, it's time to ask, how did it all end? Not just the empire, that's another saga entirely, but this vast chaotic, sensual ecosystem of Roman sexuality. Because it didn't just disappear, it was challenged, rewritten, and slowly, brick by erotic brick, replaced. Let's begin with the growing murmur from Judea. In the early years of the empire, Judaism was already present in Rome, and its sexual ethics stood in sharp contrast to the Roman norm. Where Rome emphasized freedom of the male libido, within hierarchies and roles, Jewish texts promoted restraint, fidelity, and modesty. Sex was sacred, yes, but tightly confined within marriage. Prostitution was frowned upon. Adultery wasn't just messy, it was a sin. These ideas quietly took root in Rome, especially among those tired of the city's excesses. Then came Christianity. What began as a fringe movement among the poor and persecuted eventually blossomed into one of the most powerful forces Rome had ever seen. And its message? Radical. Sex, once woven into the spiritual and social fabric of Rome, was now suspect. Pleasure was dangerous. The flesh was weak. Virginity became a virtue. Chastity, once reserved for priestesses and symbolic ritual, was now the gold standard for anyone chasing moral perfection. Of course, early Christians weren't unanimous. Some, like Paul, believed marriage was acceptable but inferior to celibacy. Others encouraged couples to abstain even within marriage, to elevate themselves spiritually. Suddenly, the gods of lust were no longer divine, they were demonic. Venus wasn't a goddess to be honoured with wine and incense, but a temptation to resist. Desire wasn't a gift, it was a test, and the state noticed. Slowly, imperial attitudes began to shift. By the time Constantine converted in the 4th century CE, Christianity was not just tolerated, it was empowered. New laws began to favour Christian morality. Pagan temples, including those dedicated to fertility and love deities, were closed or repurposed. The cult of Vesta was disbanded. Vestal virgins, once sacred protectors of Rome, vanished from the city's religious life. Their temple became a footnote. Sexual behaviours that had once been tolerated, even celebrated, were now legally restricted. Homosexual relationships, particularly those involving freeborn Roman men, were increasingly condemned. Adultery, once treated with a nod and a shrug, was punished more severely. Theatrical performances, especially those with erotic themes, were censored. Public nudity, once commonplace in baths and festivals, was now seen as scandalous. The brothels didn't vanish overnight, but they changed. Some were forced underground, others rebranded as bathhouses or inns, operating in a legal grey area. The cheerful carved penises that once pointed the way to a lupanar were chiselled off walls or plastered over. Erotic art was removed, defaced, or simply forgotten, buried under centuries of dust and shame. Even language changed. The words of love became more cautious, more abstract. The erotic poetry of Catullus and Ovid gave way to the solemn sermons of Augustine, who famously confessed to youthful lust but renounced it in favour of spiritual discipline. For Augustine, the body was not to be trusted. Sexual desire was the result of the fall, original sin made manifest in your hips. His writings would go on to influence Christian thought for centuries, and yet Rome didn't let go easily. Even as public morality stiffened, private lives continued in their old patterns. Love letters were still exchanged, secret affairs still flourished, perfumed oil still found its way onto waiting skin. But now it came with a layer of guilt, a whispered prayer of repentance, a promise to do better next time. In some corners of the empire, especially the rural areas, older beliefs clung like ivy. Shrines to Venus still received offerings, erotic mosaics were hidden, not destroyed. In Pompeii, frozen in time by volcanic ash, Rome's sensual spirit was preserved like a dream in amber, waiting for archaeologists to rediscover it and inevitably blush. Even after Rome's political collapse in the West, its legacy of desire lingered. Medieval writers copied down its stories, often with heavy censorship. Renaissance artists dug up its statues and copied its poses. Poets rediscovered Ovid and swooned all over again, and us? We're still sorting through it, still wondering how they lived, loved, lusted, still fascinated by a world where sex wasn't just physical, it was art, religion, politics, economy, performance, and rebellion. So where does that leave you? Standing in a quiet courtyard maybe, the moon bright above, a breeze slipping through the columns. You've seen how Rome turned sex into spectacle, into system, into scandal, and finally into silence. You've seen how desire both upheld and subverted power, how it was painted, performed, punished, and protected, how it crossed lines, gendered social, legal, and left behind lipstick-stained graffiti and half-erased names on stone. You probably started this journey with a little curiosity, maybe a chuckle. And now you've got the full picture, messy, layered, deeply human. Rome didn't invent sex, but it definitely turned it into something unforgettable. So here you are. Not in a brothel or a villa or a temple this time, but somewhere softer. Maybe in your bed. Finally, the light's low, the ceiling a quiet canvas above you. You've just spent what might be the most epic bedtime journey through history's most chaotic, complex, and unabashedly sensual civilization. And even though we've laughed, cringed, and probably raised an eyebrow or two together, now it's time to breathe out. Rome, this city of gods and gutters, of emperors with appetites and slaves with secrets, never really ended. Sure, the marble crumbled, the aqueducts cracked, and the last senators muttered their final laws into a void. But Rome, in all its raw humanity, still flickers in us. In every love letter, in every awkward first date, in every public scandal and private craving. We still wrestle with the same questions. What does love mean? Where does desire cross the line? Who gets to want and who gets punished for it? You've seen that sex in ancient Rome wasn't just physical. It was structure. It was rebellion. It was economy. It was performance. It was amour from the way lovers touched to the way laws controlled bodies. You've watched women bend the system, men become objects of lust, emperors rewrite rules, and poets pour their longing into ink. You've peeked inside bedrooms and bathhouses, scrolled the ancient version of Tinder carved in stone, and walked the line between sacred and sinful. And now, as your eyes begin to soften, and the details blur into the kind of dreamy haze only history can create, remember this. Rome may be ancient, but the people were not so different from us. They wanted to be seen, to be held, to be desired. They carved their names beside the ones they loved, and left behind 1,000 echoes of hands reaching for one another in the dark. So sleep now, traveller. You've earned it. May your dreams be filled with moonlit villas, misquoted poetry, and exactly one tasteful fresco of Priapus, because even history deserves a little mischief.